The world into which the Holy Roman Empire was born was a patchwork of fading Roman structures and rising Germanic polities, a landscape where memory and ambition collided. When the last Western Roman emperors had fallen into obscurity, their institutions did not vanish overnight. Law, cities, roads, and ecclesiastical networks persisted and provided a skeleton upon which new powers could be assembled. People still spoke of Rome as the center of civilized authority, and ambitious rulers of Northern Europe saw value in claiming that ancient dignity. To understand how one of those rulers transformed a frontier of small kingdoms into an empire, it helps to begin with the Franks and the man who would be called Carolus Magnus, Charlemagne. Subscribe this instant, because what you're about to see about Charlemagne isn't history, it's the forging of a new world on Rome's ashes. And only those who enter now will witness it. Charlemagne's rise was part military, part administrative genius, and part luck. He inherited a kingdom in which the Merovingian kings were figureheads and the true power lay with the mayors of the palace, the great household stewards like Charles Martel, who understood that control over the military and the royal household meant real rule. Charles Martel's victory at Tours in 732 against an invading Muslim force resurrected his prestige and set the stage for his son Pepin the Short's marriage of arms with the papacy. Pepin deposed the last Merovingian king and accepted anointing from the Pope, establishing a precedent. Legitimacy could be coupled with sacred sanction, and the papacy could gain a protector in return for blessing a new dynasty. That bargain between Frankish rulers and the papacy would prove decisive for Charlemagne. In 800, after decades of expansion and consolidation, he was crowned emperor by Pope Leo III in Rome, an act that astonished and delighted many and unsettled others. The ceremony was not simply a decoration, it was a statement that a West European ruler could claim successor status to the Roman emperors. But it also raised awkward questions about who had the authority to grant such an honor. Was the Pope elevating a king or reviving an imperial office that had lapsed? The answers would not be simple, and debates about the source of imperial power would shape the politics of Europe for centuries. Charlemagne's empire stretched across what is now France, Germany, parts of Italy, and into the fringes of Central Europe and Spain. He governed by a mixture of personal oversight, delegated counts and dukes, traveling courts, and an administrative innovation known as the Missi Dominici, royal agents sent in pairs to check on local officials and enforce royal policy. He also issued capitularies, sets of rules and decrees that articulated law and governance across a diverse realm. These measures helped to bind disparate regions together while still leaving space for local customs, a balancing act of central authority and regional autonomy that would remain an enduring tension. Beyond governance, Charlemagne fostered an intellectual revival that historians call the Carolingian Renaissance. Monasteries became centers of learning, script was standardized to the clear hand we now call Caroline minuscule, and texts, religious and secular, were copied and preserved. Scholars were invited to court, classical texts were rediscovered, and education for the clergy and administration was emphasized. This cultural investment was not mere decoration. Literate officials were essential for managing justice, taxation, and the complex paperwork of a multi-ethnic empire. Yet Charlemagne's death in 814 exposed the brittle threads that held his creation together. His son Louis the Pious inherited vast lands but a weakened sense of dynastic cohesion. Louis sought to continue his father's work, but family rivalries and the demands of local elites eroded centralized control. Power built on personal authority is inherently fragile when confronted with competing claims and generations of ambitious nobles. When Louis's health failed and his sons argued over inheritance, the empire's unity began to fracture. The divisions accelerated after Louis's death, culminating in the Treaty of Verdun in 843. His three surviving sons, Lothair, Louis the German, and Charles the Bald, partitioned the realm into roughly eastern, middle, and western portions. The Middle Kingdom, holding the imperial title and stretching from the North Sea to Italy, proved especially difficult to sustain amid pressure from its powerful neighbors. This partition created political spaces that would evolve separately: West Francia toward the future France, and East Francia, where Germanic structures and identities would become decisive for the future empire. East Francia, the eastern portion of Charlemagne's former realm, was a mosaic of duchies and counties where local lords exercised considerable autonomy. It contained Saxony, Bavaria, Swabia, Franconia, and other regions, each with their own leaders and traditions. Over the next decades, the memory of Carolingian unity dimmed, and regional strongmen gained prominence as central authority diminished. The period between Verdun and the rise of a new imperial dynasty saw increasing decentralization, driven by warfare, Viking raids along rivers, Magyar incursions from the east, and Islamic raids along Mediterranean coasts. The constant threat of external invasion was one of the great crucibles shaping late 9th and 10th century politics. Vikings descended rivers and raided inland towns. The Magyars swept into Central Europe with light cavalry that could outmaneuver slower Frankish forces, and Muslim raiders struck along the Mediterranean and into southern France. These raids exposed the weaknesses of rulers who could not reliably defend territory and forced local communities to negotiate protection with powerful magnates. Thus, military necessity encouraged the rise of regional leaders able to organize defense, often at the expense of centralized royal authority. Amid this fragmentation, ideas about power and legitimacy persisted. The concept of translatio imperii, the transfer of imperial authority from Rome to other hands, remained potent. Popes and princes both used the symbolism of Rome to bolster their claims. The Pope's willingness to crown Frankish rulers had given the Carolingians a sacral dimension, and even when Carolingian power waned, the notion that an emperor could embody Christian order endured as an attractive ideal. This ideal would be revived and reshaped as new leaders sought to marry spiritual endorsement with temporal domination. Local aristocracies profited from the vacuum of central power and from the collapse of a bureaucratic apparatus that had required literate administrators. Land grants, private war, and familial alliances became the currency of authority. Lords fortified their castles, raised private retinues, and exercised jurisdiction over peasants and towns. The social order moved toward what we now label early feudalism, a system of personal bonds and obligations rather than a single bureaucratic state. Still, the memory of a unified Christian empire lingered in monasteries and chancelleries, and among those who believed that Europe needed a renewed center. The 9th and 10th centuries were also moments of ecclesiastical change and reform that interacted with political shifts. Monastic life, particularly in reformed houses, rediscovered discipline and learning, offering stability amid secular chaos. Monasteries were often repositories of archives and symbols of continuity. Their abbots could be influential negotiators between shrinking royal administrations and local aristocrats. Reformers sought moral and liturgical renewal, and the papacy, though often politically constrained, looked for powerful protectors to assert its independence from local Roman nobles. In East Francia, a new family rose from the backcountry of Saxony, the Ludolfing or Ottonian house. Henry I, later called Henry the Fowler, emerged in the early 10th century as a leader who could negotiate a difficult patchwork of dukes and countly powers. He was elected king in 919, a signal that kingship in East Francia had become elective in practice if not in theory, that is, powerful magnates chose a leader they believed could defend the realm. Henry consolidated royal authority through marriage alliances, careful appointments, and an ability to placate or outmaneuver rival dukes without fully subduing them. Henry focused on fortifying frontier defenses and reasserting control over royal lands and revenues. He understood that strong cavalry and fortified towns could halt or at least deter Magyar raids that had terrorized the countryside. Henry's rule stabilized East Francia and set the stage for his son Otto, who would inherit a kingdom shaped by both the burdens of defense and the opportunities of partnering with the Church. The Ottonian project built on Carolingian precedents but adapted them to new realities of power and to a more pronounced Germanic elite structure. Otto I, known as Otto the Great, came to the throne in 936 and proved an exceptionally skillful ruler in war, law, and diplomacy. He extended royal influence into Italy and consolidated control over the duchies within East Francia through a mixture of force and conciliation. Otto combined military campaigns against external enemies with a policy of placing trusted churchmen in key positions. Bishops and abbots, celibate and without hereditary kin, were less likely to build rival dynasties. This strategy, often called the imperial church system, allowed Otto to create a loyal administrative backbone, but it also entwined his power intimately with the fortunes of the papacy and the reforming clergy. Otto's use of ecclesiastical office as a political tool had deep echoes. The Carolingians had long relied on bishops for administration, yet Otto's adoption of this method was systematic and deliberate. He granted lands and secular authority to bishops, who then administered regions as royal officials while remaining loyal to the king because their positions were non-hereditary. This arrangement reinforced royal oversight but also created a class of powerful clerics invested in imperial stability. It became a defining feature of Ottonian governance and a precursor to later medieval tensions between popes and emperors over appointment rights. External threats continued to shape his rule. The decisive military moment of Otto's early reign came at the Battle of Lechfeld in 955, where his forces decisively defeated the Magyars. That victory ended the Magyar threat to Western Europe and secured the Danube frontier, giving Otto the breathing room to project authority into Italy and to consider larger claims of leadership. The triumph at Lechfeld was not only a military success but also a moral and political vindication of the king who had taken the helm in a perilous age. It strengthened his position at home and made him an attractive partner or rival in the dynastic chessboard of Europe. Italy was both a prize and a problem for rulers north of the Alps. The Italian peninsula held Rome, with its pope and imperial legacy, and control of Italy conferred prestige and access to Mediterranean networks. Otto intervened in Italian politics to restore order and to secure the papacy from the machinations of local Roman nobles. In 961 he marched to Rome, settled disputes, and in 962 he accepted imperial coronation from Pope John XII, an act strikingly reminiscent of Charlemagne's coronation centuries earlier. Otto's coronation asserted a renewed idea of a revived Western Empire, now centered in a Germanic-bodied polity but claiming Roman spiritual heritage. The relationship between Otto and the papacy was complex and mutually useful but also precarious. Popes needed secular protectors to maintain independence from local Roman aristocrats. Kings needed papal blessing to claim imperial dignity. Otto's coronation was thus part sacrament and part strategic maneuver. Yet the Pope and the Emperor had different agendas, and tensions emerged over influence in Italy and over control of appointments. The interplay of spiritual and secular claims would later erupt into open conflict, but in Otto's time it served to knit together an empire that wore both crowns, kingly and papal, as parts of a single garment. Otto's imperial ideology drew on the language of Renovatio Imperii Romanorum, the renewal of the Roman Empire. He positioned himself as the restorer of Christian order, a successor to Charlemagne and a protector of the Church. His court was not merely militaristic, it fostered learning and liturgical standardization and supported monastic reform movements that emphasized clerical discipline and intellectual life. The emperor's image was cultivated through ceremonies, royal diplomas, and visual regalia that claimed continuity with Rome. Symbols mattered. The crown, the scepter, and the liturgy of coronation conferred a palpable sense of lineage and authority. Administration under Otto refined earlier Carolingian practices while adapting to new political realities. He preserved the practice of issuing written diplomas to record grants and privileges, and he relied on royal palaces and assemblies, things called placida, where nobles and officials swore loyalty and resolved disputes. The Missi Dominici model had faded, but the idea that the king could send envoys and represent central justice survived in adapted forms. Otto's reliance on bishops to govern regions functioned as a more stable alternative to appointing local secular magnates who might later claim hereditary rights. Marriages and alliances were another instrument of imperial policy. Otto arranged marriages not just to secure personal alliances but to connect his house with the kingdoms and principalities that shaped Europe. Through strategic marriages, he linked his dynasty with Italian and Slavic elites, extending influence and creating obligations. Dynastic diplomacy mattered because it created bonds that could be invoked in moments of crisis, and because it shaped succession possibilities. The web of marriages under Otto made the empire more than a military confederation. It tied bloodlines into the architecture of power. The emperorship itself remained a complex institution, part ritual, part legal fiction, part real power. Otto's coronation made him emperor in the eyes of many contemporaries, yet the concrete reality of imperial rule still depended on the willingness of local lords to obey. The emperor could grant lands, convoke councils, and adjudicate disputes, but his reach varied across regions. Effective imperial government required negotiation with dukes, bishops, and abbots, and the art of ruling lay in balancing force with persuasion and symbolic legitimacy with practical concessions. Subscribe if you also think it's outrageous that an emperor's power could vanish the moment a duke refused to kneel. Culturally, the Ottonian period displayed a blend of northern warrior ethos and Roman Christian ceremonial. Art and manuscript illumination under Otto's patronage reflected classical motifs rekindled by monastic workshops. Churches were endowed and relics prized, linking material piety to political prestige. Liturgical ceremonies at the imperial court emphasized the sacral dimensions of kingship, with the emperor envisioned as a Christian prince ordained to maintain order and justice. Such imagery reinforced the ideology that political authority had a divine imprimatur. The legal landscape also evolved. Customary law, written capitularies, and local traditions intermingled, creating a tapestry of legal practice that varied from region to region. The emperor could issue rulings and charters, but local counts and lords adjudicated much of daily justice. Over time, the reliance on written documentation grew as monasteries and chancelleries preserved records. Documentary culture became a tool for asserting rights and privileges in an age when power was often contested in courts and assemblies. This expansion of paperwork made claims more durable and contests more formalized. Trade and economy in the early medieval West were changing in ways that supported political consolidation. Riverine networks and burgeoning towns provided revenue and logistics for rulers who could exploit them. Markets revived in many regions, and coinage, though uneven, began to circulate more widely. Economic vitality in towns strengthened the hand of kings who could protect commerce or charter town privileges, while also giving local elites new sources of wealth independent of agricultural land. Language and identity were fluid in this period. Latin remained the language of the church and of learned discourse, but vernacular dialects flourished among peoples who would later become distinctly German, French, or Italian in identity. Identity was often local and dynastic rather than national in the modern sense, loyalties attached to kinship, lordship, and regional custom. Yet the notion of a Christian empire with a Germanic spine and Roman sacrality helped forge a broader political imagination. It allowed leaders like Otto to claim an identity that transcended a single people while still rooted in northern aristocratic power. The Ottos faced internal rivals and rebellions as often as external enemies, and they dealt with these challenges through a mixture of clemency and ruthlessness. Rebellious dukes had to be placated with lands and offices or restrained by force. The balance between concession and coercion defined much of royal policy. Otto's capacity to act decisively in military campaigns, while also cultivating alliances and promoting loyal churchmen, made his rule resilient. When he faced treachery or papal intrigues, he met them with a combination of diplomacy, military expeditions, and legal repudiations. One memorable instance of papal complexity came with Pope John XII, whose behavior scandalized some contemporaries and who alternately sought Otto's protection and plotted against him. Otto's intervention in Rome, his deposition of certain Roman nobles, and his crowning as emperor were followed by further conflicts when the Pope sought to assert autonomy. This episode reveals the paradox at the heart of Christian empire. The emperor was protector of the church, yet the Pope was a spiritual authority whose independence was both politically useful and potentially disruptive. Their relationship set precedents for later investiture disputes between popes and emperors. Beyond the political, life for most people in the 10th century continued according to agricultural rhythms and local custom. Peasants tilled fields under obligations to landlords, women managed households and sometimes wielded influence in estate affairs, and townspeople pursued crafts, trade, and communal governance. The reach of any emperor into everyday life was limited, felt mostly through taxation, legal adjudications, and the security of roads and markets. Yet the presence of an imperial court and the church's missionary networks created channels of cultural and administrative influence even in remote regions. Military organization also evolved under Otto. Heavy cavalry became more prominent as nobles provided armored horsemen in exchange for land or prestige, and fortified towns became focal points of defense. The loss of a centralized standing army meant kings depended on levies and the military obligations of their vassals, but the king's ability to marshal and direct these forces remained decisive in times of crisis. Victory at key battles and sieges enhanced royal prestige and deterred rivals, while defeat could embolden rebellion and fragmentation. Clerical reform movements began to gain traction during and after Otto's reign, emphasizing the moral integrity of the clergy, celibacy for priests, and the independence of monastic houses. These reforms were sometimes aligned with imperial interests and sometimes at odds with them, depending on whether reforming clerics sought direct imperial support or papal backing. The interplay of reform and polity further entangled the church with statecraft, for monasteries not only offered spiritual renewal but also administrative competence and moral authority that kings could harness. Otto's imperial court became a crucible of cultural and political activity, a place where poets, clerics, and administrators mingled with dukes and envoys. Manuscripts commissioned by the court, richly illuminated and theologically nuanced, projected imperial identity and piety. The court celebrated liturgical festivals that reinforced the emperor's role as protector and promoter of Christian order. Such rituals were not mere pageantry, they communicated the values and hierarchy that underpinned governance. The legacy of Otto's coronation in 962 was to anchor the idea of a revived empire in Central Europe with Rome as its spiritual center and a Germanic dynasty as its secular engine. The title emperor acquired renewed currency, and successive rulers would claim it as a central aim. Yet the new empire was not an absolute monarchy, it was an elective and negotiated construct, dependent on the support of great lords, bishops, and the papacy. The institution that emerged was thus sui generis, a decentralized imperial framework where the emperor's authority waxed and waned with personal skill, alliances, and military success. In the generations following Otto, his dynasty maintained the imperial ideal even as political realities changed. His heirs continued to defend the eastern frontiers, to intervene in Italy, and to place bishops in key positions, but they also faced new pressures from ambitious aristocratic families. The structure Otto built proved adaptable, able to incorporate newly conquered territories and manage shifting loyalties. The notion of a Holy Roman Empire, as later chroniclers would call it, grew from these origins, a polity that combined Germanic roots, Roman symbolism, and Christian legitimacy. Historically, scholars debate how continuous the Holy Roman Empire was with its Carolingian predecessor and how novel the Ottonian adjustments were. Some emphasize direct continuity, administrative practices, legal language, and imperial ideology transmitted across generations. Others stress the transformations, different geographic center of power, deeper reliance on ecclesiastical administrators, and a political culture more responsive to ducal autonomy. The truth lies in synthesis. Both continuity and innovation shaped the course from Charlemagne to Otto. The story of this birth is not simply political narrative, it is also a human tale of ambition, faith, ingenuity, and contingency. Charlemagne's majesty rested on military prowess and administrative foresight. Louis the Pious struggled with succession and piety. Henry the Fowler consolidated what remained of royal power. Otto the Great formalized a new imperial order through marriage, military success, and ecclesiastical partnership. Each figure responded to the constraints and opportunities of their times, and each left institutions and precedents that guided their successors. Material culture reflected imperial aspirations as well. Churches were built or renovated, reliquaries were crafted with gold and gemstones, and royal insignia became more elaborate. These objects functioned as portable statements of authority, to carry the emperor's banner or to touch a relic associated with a holy figure was to partake in a sacro-political world. Courtly life cultivated not only governance but a cultivated aesthetic that reinforced the sacredness of kingship. Such materiality made abstract claims about authority tangible and persuasive. The interplay between regional diversity and imperial aspiration produced a political ecosystem that was complex and often fragile. The emperor presided over a realm where law, custom, economy, and loyalty could differ sharply from one valley to the next. Negotiation, adaptability, and a sense of ritualized hierarchy sustained imperial power more than immutable institutions. It was an empire always in the making, capable of reassertion and vulnerable to disintegration, dependent on the personalities of its rulers and the structures they forged. To listen to these centuries is to hear the echo of Roman administration, the clamor of barbarian warfare, the chant of monasteries, and the murmur of courts where kings and bishops brokered peace and arranged marriages. It is to perceive a world in which authority had to be constantly reaffirmed through ceremony, law, and arms. From Charlemagne's coronation to Otto the Great's imperial crowning, the birth of what would be called the Holy Roman Empire was a process of reviving and reshaping imperial concepts to fit a changed Europe. By the time Otto died in 973, the political map of Central Europe had been redrawn. The empire he helped create was not a centralized state but a layered authority that combined sacred legitimization with pragmatic governance. His victories over invaders and his interventions in Italy transformed the balance of power, while his administrative choices set patterns for church-state relations. The institutions and relationships he established would endure, evolve, and sometimes fracture, but they provided a durable framework for medieval imperial politics. Understanding how the empire was born requires attending to both legal and symbolic acts, decrees and coronations, treaties and marriages, and to the everyday practices of lordship that actually govern people's lives. It means recognizing the role of monastic scribes in preserving order, of bishops in administering justice, and of noble households in raising armies. It means seeing the papacy not only as a spiritual office but as a political actor seeking protection and influence. These varied strands braided together into the cord that tethered empire to church and kings to laurels. The birth of the empire was also a story of religious imagination. The idea that a Christian ruler bore responsibility for protecting Christendom gave political acts a moral framing. Rulers like Charlemagne and Otto presented their wars as defenses of the faith and their administration as service to God. This sacral dimension made the empire more than a territorial project. It was a moral and religious claim that bound rulers and ruled into a common narrative about order, salvation, and providence. The language of mission and renewal animated imperial rhetoric and explained many of its actions to contemporaries. Regional identities that developed in the wake of the Carolingian partition would later solidify into principalities, duchies, and kingdoms. But during the period from Charlemagne to Otto, these identities were still in flux. People identified with kin, with lord, with town, and sometimes with a broader Christian polity. The empires that rose and fell in these centuries were thus built upon shifting loyalties and layered allegiances. The Holy Roman Empire's birth was less a single founding moment than a series of linked responses to warfare, opportunity, and the enduring prestige of Rome. The political theology underpinning imperial claims influenced diplomatic rituals as well. Embassies, oaths, and the exchange of gifts were not mere niceties but legal and moral acts that created bonds of dependence and obligation. A ruler received envoys in court and made public oaths witnessed by clerics and nobles. These rituals were binding in ways that modern legalism sometimes struggles to grasp. The emperor's capacity to adjudicate disputes and to convene synods gave imperial authority a ritualized form that had real consequences for governance. Even as the emperor's prestige rose, the underlying dynamics of medieval power meant that emperorship was perpetually contested. Local elites jealously guarded their prerogatives, and the capacity of the emperor to enforce decrees depended upon alliances and military mobilization. The administrative sophistication of Charlemagne's court had given way to a more negotiated form of rule, yet the symbolic power of the emperor, crowned in Rome, associated with universal Christian kingship, remained potent. That paradox, between sacred universality and localized power, defined the empire's earliest centuries. As you imagine these centuries while driving or working, picture shifting lines on the map, fortified towns ringing with activity, monasteries copying manuscripts by lamplight, and the clatter of cavalry at dawn. Picture emperors traveling through their realms, hearing grievances in courts, and negotiating marriages and alliances that would ripple through generations. The empire's birth was a living process of movement and negotiation, a blend of ritual and force, belief and calculation, ambition and compromise. Finally, the transition from Charlemagne to Otto the Great shows how ideas travel and transform: a Roman imperial vocabulary, Christian sacramental theology, and Germanic political practice fused into a distinctive form of medieval rulership. Charlemagne's coronation provided a template. The Treaty of Verdun showed the limits of unity. The Ottonian dynasty taught that ecclesiastical partnerships could stabilize royal power. The Holy Roman Empire's origins are best understood not as a sudden foundation but as a long gestation, where memory, crisis, and creativity converged to produce an institution that would shape European history for a millennium. The story I will tell begins with crowns and crosses, with banners and basilicas, and with a single, audacious idea: that sacred authority and temporal power belonged together, that an empire could be both Christian and imperial at once. This idea took shape in the ruins of Rome, in the monasteries of Gaul, and in the court of a man named Charlemagne, whose coronation in the year 800 would echo for 1,000 years. When the Pope placed a crown upon Charlemagne's head, he was making a bold claim about the nature of kingship and the source of authority. He was saying that empire rested on God and that the Pope could bestow divine legitimacy. From that moment forward, every emperor would live under the shadow of a double sovereignty, one spiritual, centered on the Bishop of Rome, and one temporal, centered on the ruler who claimed to carry Roman order into a fractured Europe. Charlemagne's empire did not survive his immediate descendants intact, but the idea of a revived Roman authority lingered. Out of the fragmented political landscape of 10th century Europe, a Germanic polity began to coalesce under kings who sought recognition and coronation from the Pope. Otto I, crowned emperor in 962, reworked the relationship. He protected Rome and the papacy while strengthening his control over the Italian peninsula. That relationship, protector to protected, patron to priest, created an interdependence that could be both mutually beneficial and explosively contentious. As the centuries turned, emperors and popes grew entangled in one another's affairs. Emperors needed the Pope's blessing to claim universal authority, and popes needed emperors to enforce decrees and to police the turbulent territories of central Italy. Yet each success for one party planted a seed of insecurity in the other, for every act of support or assertion raised a question: who held the final say? These tensions simmered for generations, punctuated by alliances and betrayals, until the 11th century brought a crisis that would reshape medieval Christendom: the investiture controversy. To understand the controversy, one must understand a medieval world in which offices came with land, wealth, and jurisdiction. When a bishop or abbot was appointed, he did not merely take on a spiritual role. He became a major landholder, a lord with vassals and revenues. Secular rulers had for centuries asserted the right to install bishops and abbots, investiture, because those appointments affected the balance of power within their territories. That practice, convenient for rulers, had always made the papacy uneasy because it blurred the line between the sacred calling of clergy and the secular ambitions of kings. The crisis that erupted in the 11th century was not spontaneous. It was the culmination of centuries of monastic reform and intellectual ferment. The Cluniac and later the Gregorian reforms argued that the Church should purify itself, reject simony, and free clerical appointments from lay influence. Reform-minded clergy believed that a bishop's nearest lord should be God and his Church, not a king who could treat sacred offices as rewards for political loyalty. These reformers pressed for a profound rethinking. The spiritual authority of the Church had to be autonomous if it was to be moral and effective. Into this environment stepped Hildebrand, a monk who would become Pope Gregory VII, and a ruler who would become Henry IV of the Salian dynasty. Hildebrand was a formidable organizer and a relentless moralist. He had long argued against simony and for clerical celibacy, and he saw lay investiture as a poisonous compromise. Henry, a young and ambitious emperor, viewed investiture as a practical necessity, an instrument of governance that allowed him to bind bishops to his rule and to stabilize his realm. The confrontation of personalities, dogged reformer and imperious monarch, turned theoretical debate into historical drama. Gregory VII went beyond mere reform. He claimed papal supremacy in spiritual matters and asserted that the Pope could depose emperors who acted contrary to God's law. His Dictatus Papae, a set of propositions, proclaimed ideas that would have sounded revolutionary. The Pope could appoint, transfer, and depose bishops. The Pope alone could interpret canon law. The Pope could depose emperors. For many contemporaries, those statements were startling, for they placed the papacy above secular kings on grounds of spiritual authority. To Gregory, spiritual authority implied the right to enforce moral purity in rulers and to restore the Church's independence. Henry IV responded in kind because he could not accept a pope who claimed the power to depose rulers or to withdraw the crown from Christian kings. He insisted that kings had always participated in the investiture process and that their presence was necessary to guarantee stability and order. The conflict escalated when Henry continued to invest bishops in defiance of papal letters, prompting Gregory to excommunicate the emperor. Excommunication in the Middle Ages was not merely a theological sentence, it was a political weapon that cut a king off from Christian society and invited his vassals to withdraw loyalty. The image that most people recall from this struggle is Henry's penitential journey to Canossa in 1077, and with reason. He crossed the Alps and stood barefoot in the snow outside the fortress where Gregory was staying, waiting 3 days for absolution. That scene, an emperor humbling himself before a pope, was cinematically powerful and symbolically rich. It suggested that the papacy had triumphed, that spiritual authority had asserted dominance over temporal power, and that kings must now answer to an ecclesiastical court. Yet the victory was more ambiguous than the spectacle suggested. After Canossa, both sides regrouped. Henry secured the support of German princes who were wary of papal interference and arranged for an antipope to be set up against Gregory. The German nobility saw an opportunity to assert their own interests in the vacuum of imperial authority, and the empire itself began to fracture into competing princely territories whose loyalties were negotiable. Meanwhile, the papacy's moral authority had been enhanced, but its political situation remained precarious as it relied on fickle alliances and the protection of regional powers. Moving beyond the drama between Gregory and Henry, the dispute over investiture exposed fundamental conceptual conflicts about law and allegiance. Was an office a spiritual trust vested by the church and therefore non-negotiable by kings, or was it a social and political position, interwoven with feudal obligations and thus necessarily subject to royal control? This question did not have an easy answer because medieval society combined legal pluralism with overlapping jurisdictions. Bishops were spiritual shepherds, feudal lords, and agents of royal administration all at once, and disentangling those roles proved nearly impossible. Over decades, the conflict evolved into a bargaining process as much as a moral crusade. Both sides learned to use royal councils, synods, and papal bulls to shape public opinion and to codify their positions. The struggle extended beyond Rome and Germany into Italy, Burgundy, and the lands of the papal patrimony. In every locale, local bishops, abbots, and princes made choices influenced by immediate interests, protection, revenue, autonomy. And those choices compounded into a European pattern of negotiated sovereignty. Ultimately, the investiture controversy found a compromise in the Concordat of Worms in 1122, but compromise did not mean surrender. The agreement distinguished between the spiritual and temporal aspects of episcopal office. The church would invest bishops with spiritual symbols like the ring and the staff, while the emperor retained a role in granting the temporalities, the lands, and the secular rights attached to the office. The resolution represented a pragmatic balance. The church affirmed clerical freedom in spiritual matters while the emperor preserved a measure of control over the worldly dimensions of office holding. Yet the Concordat did not end conflict between emperors and popes, it transformed it. What had been an all-or-nothing battle over investiture gave way to a subtler contest over appointments, jurisdiction, and influence. Emperors and popes maneuvered through alliances with princes, towns, and religious institutions. The papacy continued to press for moral and institutional reforms across Europe, while emperors struggled to assert centralized authority over increasingly autonomous principalities. The century after Worms was marked by new confrontations as the imperial idea tried to find a place in a landscape of rising local identities. The emperors of the Hohenstaufen dynasty, especially Frederick I, known to history as Barbarossa, revived ambitions of imperial restoration in Italy and sought to reassert authority over northern Italian cities and the papacy. Frederick's campaigns drew him into conflict not only with the papal curia but with a newly energetic civic movement in Lombardy that resisted imperial control. The resulting wars were as much about jurisdiction and fiscal rights as they were about honor and prestige. In those struggles, the papacy and the Italian communes found occasional allies in one another. Popes could exploit civic resentment against imperial taxation and military conscription, while cities welcomed papal backing as a counterweight to imperial might. Yet the alliance was always tentative because popes also harbored fears of republican city-states that might become too independent or too secular. The papal strategy alternated between nurturing communal freedoms that weakened imperial power and seeking direct papal authority over the same territories when that suited Rome's interests. By the time Frederick II ascended to the imperial throne in the early 13th century, the contest between the papacy and the empire had acquired a slower, more bureaucratic texture. Frederick was a king of many worlds, a Sicilian monarch ruling a centralized state in southern Italy and a German king whose authority in the north was contested. He cultivated learning, patronized the arts, and attempted to build a centralized legal and administrative machine, but his disregard for papal primacy drew repeated censures and excommunications. The papacy saw in Frederick both a political rival and a potential corrupter of spiritual order. Frederick's clashes with the popes were intense because both sides practically weaponized spiritual sanctions. The papacy could excommunicate and place regions under interdict, which suspended public worship and pressured rulers by disrupting social and religious life. Emperors, for their part, sought alliances with dissenters and contested papal claims by promoting antipopes when necessary. The use of antipopes was a radical means of undermining papal legitimacy, a measure indicating how deeply the contest had moved into the realm of symbolic power. As the 14th century unfolded, new factors reshaped the contest. The papacy's relocation to Avignon in 1309, under heavy French influence, weakened Rome's universal prestige and made popes appear susceptible to political manipulation. The imperial elective system, meanwhile, continued to empower princes whose immediate concerns were local rather than imperial. Emperors became compacts of title and aspiration, lacking a uniform bureaucracy capable of enforcing centralized decisions across the diverse territories of the empire. This asymmetry gradually tipped the balance away from any simple imperial supremacy. While Avignon discredited the papacy in the eyes of many, the empire had its own woes. Internal divisions, dynastic disputes, and the rise of powerful territorial princes diluted the emperor's practical authority. The Golden Bull of 1356 attempted to regularize imperial elections and secure a degree of constitutional order by fixing the number and rights of electors, but it also entrenched the power of those princes who would henceforth form the core of imperial politics. With power vested more securely in regional elites, the emperor's independence was constrained and his ability to contest the papacy diminished in practice. Yet the papacy itself was not immune from internal dissent and external criticism. The Great Schism of 1378 to 1417, during which rival claimants asserted papal authority from Rome and Avignon, further eroded the spiritual credibility of the papacy. When multiple popes claimed to be the true pontiff, the moral clarity that had been a papal strength in the 11th century was obscured by factionalism and intrigue. The schism invited secular rulers to assert independence from papal interference and to exploit papal weakness to secure their own ecclesiastical appointments. The late medieval period also saw the growth of powerful ecclesiastical principalities within the empire itself. Bishops and prince-abbots governed territories as secular lords while wielding spiritual authority. This dual role made ecclesiastical rulers pivotal actors in the tug-of-war between Rome and the empire because they could act as conduits of papal influence while enjoying local autonomy. Popes sometimes cultivated these prelates to extend their reach, while emperors sought to control them to maintain cohesion and revenue. Leading up to the Reformation, the fragile balance between popes and emperors shifted again under the pressures of new religious ideas, rising national monarchies, and economic transformation. When Martin Luther challenged the Church in 1517, he accused a corrupt ecclesiastical establishment of selling salvation like an open market, and his critique reverberated across Europe in ways that neither Roman nor imperial institutions were prepared to contain. The Reformation posed a unique challenge to the old order because it questioned the very mediating role of the Church and, by extension, the moral authority that the papacy had exercised over rulers. Charles V, who ruled an empire that spanned from Spain to the Low Countries and from the Americas to Austria, faced an almost impossible situation. He was, by inheritance, the Holy Roman Emperor, but he also had a pressing need to preserve unity in the face of religious upheaval. His attempts to reconcile Lutheran princes with the imperial center were vexed by his commitments to Catholic orthodoxy and by the political autonomy coveted by German rulers. The Diet of Worms in 1521, where Luther refused to recant, symbolized for many the breakdown of a consensual religious order and the emergence of confessional politics. The Peace of Augsburg in 1555 temporarily froze the confessional map of the empire with a pragmatic formula: rulers would determine the religion of their territories. The principle Cuius Regio, Ius Religio acknowledged the ascendancy of territorial sovereignty over universal ecclesiastical claims. For the papacy, this settlement was a blow because it conceded to secular princes the power to shape religion within their domains. For the emperor and the princes, it was a solution of expedience that underscored the declining reach of Rome and the increasing fragmentation of Christendom into confessional sovereignties. The 17th century brought a climactic conflict that fused political, religious, and dynastic competition into a continental catastrophe, the 30 Years' War. What began in the Holy Roman Empire as a localized struggle between Protestant and Catholic states escalated into a general European war as France, Sweden, Spain, and other powers intervened. The war devastated Central Europe, depopulated regions, and undermined the idea of a unified Christian commonwealth under imperial or papal leadership. The Peace of Westphalia in 1648 concluded the war with a set of treaties that rewired European politics. It affirmed the sovereignty of territorial rulers and extended the principle of religious settlement to include Calvinists alongside Catholics and Lutherans. The treaties limited external authorities' ability to meddle in domestic affairs, a legal and diplomatic shift that reduced the papacy's direct leverage over the internal governance of German states. The empire that emerged from Westphalia was a much more decentralized confederation of states than the medieval imperial vision of universal Christian order. Despite the diminishing political clout of the papacy in northern and central Europe, the Pope retained influence in southern Italy and in Catholic monarchies that continued to pay deference to Rome. The Habsburg emperors, who often styled themselves defenders of the faith, maintained close ties with the papacy when it served mutual interests, and they frequently sought papal legitimation for their dynastic claims. Yet the pattern of interaction had evolved into one characterized less by papal supremacy and more by pragmatic alliances, marriages, and legal instruments. In the 18th century, the Enlightenment posed a secular challenge to both imperial and papal authority. Philosophers questioned divine right, promoted rational governance, and advanced ideas about individual rights that were at odds with the medieval fusion of sacred and secular power. Monarchs like Joseph II of Austria pursued enlightened reforms that included asserting greater control over the church within their territories, a policy called Josephinism. These measures asserted the state's right to regulate ecclesiastical affairs and continued the long trend of territorial rulers eroding papal control over local churches. The Holy Roman Empire stumbled toward its end as the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic eras reconfigured Europe. Revolutionary France declared the rights of citizens and sought to reorganize territories according to rational principles, dissolving medieval arrangements like the ecclesiastical principalities and imposing new administrative divisions. Napoleon's conquests forced the German states to modernize, consolidate, and in many cases to secularize church lands. In 1806, pressed by Napoleon's reorganization of the German political map and the formation of the Confederation of the Rhine, the last emperor, Francis II, abdicated the imperial title and formally dissolved the Holy Roman Empire. The papacy continued to exist after 1806, but the age in which the Pope could credibly claim to arbitrate the fate of emperors was largely over. The dissolution of the empire signified not only the end of an institution but the closure of a long historical possibility that a single, semi-sacred imperial order could regulate Christian Europe under papal and imperial authority. Instead, Europe moved toward nation-states, secular constitutions, and new forms of international law that relegated medieval concepts of papal imperial symphony to history. To appreciate the investiture controversy in all its nuance, one must return to its everyday mechanics, how the ring and crozier served as symbols of spiritual authority, while the scepter and lance stood for temporal power. When a bishop was invested with ring and staff, the church affirmed his pastoral and supervisory role. When a ruler conferred the symbols of office, he asserted the territorial and fiscal obligations attached to that person. The dual investiture ceremonies were not mere pageantry, they were the ritual expression of competing social orders, and every investiture was both a legal transaction and a moral claim. We should also remember the social and cultural dimensions. Monasteries functioned as centers of learning and moral critique, and monastic reformers played a pivotal role in shaping papal policies. Their insistence on clerical purity was not simply asceticism, it was a program to purify society by ensuring that those who preached and administered the sacraments were themselves beyond reproach. The spiritual renewal movements lent moral urgency to papal assertions, making the papacy's demands resonate with lay audiences who increasingly resented clerical abuses and the corruption of spiritual offices. The language used by both sides in the controversy mattered enormously. Terms like simony, canonical election, and excommunication were freighted with theological and social meaning. Simony, buying or selling holy offices, was a crime against the Church's sacramental integrity and a scandal that reformers used to shame lay interference. Canonical election implied that the local church or its clergy had a role in choosing bishops. When kings ignored this, reformers argued, they violated law and conscience. Excommunication, meanwhile, was a dramatic and public condemnation that threatened a ruler's moral legitimacy and could unravel political alliances. Beyond the immediate legalisms, the investiture controversy stimulated intellectual development in medieval political theory. Thinkers began to articulate more precise theories of law, sovereignty, and the relationship between clerical and secular jurisdictions. Canon lawyers defended ecclesiastical autonomy by appealing to sacramental theology and scriptural precedent, while secular jurisconsults developed arguments about the necessities of government and the rights of princes. The resulting corpus of legal thought fed into later constitutional developments across Europe. The long shadow of the controversy also shaped the structure of the empire itself. Because emperors could never again depend entirely on direct royal appointments to secure control, they had to negotiate continually with princes, bishops, and imperial cities. This negotiation produced a layered sovereignty in which local jurisdictions retained significant autonomy. The imperial title became in practice a star around which a constellation of semi-independent powers orbited, each drawing from its own traditions of law, privilege, and custom. The papacy's influence likewise adapted. When papal moral authority was high, Rome could press for reforms and assert jurisdictional claims. When papal prestige waned, popes adopted diplomatic and political strategies, cultivating alliances with monarchies, sponsoring crusades, or seeking the support of religious orders. Over time, the papacy's toolkit included both spiritual sanctions and the instruments of diplomacy, patronage, and canon law, reflecting a willingness to operate within the changing grammar of European politics. Important to this history are the lived experiences of ordinary people who often felt the consequences of these high politics in their daily lives. When a bishopric changed hands, peasants might see changes in taxation, obligations, or judicial practice. When a region was placed under interdict, laypeople experienced a suspension of certain sacraments, which could create spiritual anxiety and social strain. The contest between pope and emperor was thus not merely an elite quarrel, it altered the rhythms of parishes, markets, and domestic life across Christendom. Another dimension to consider is the interplay between rhetoric and ritual. Both pope and emperor relied on ceremonies, processions, and public displays to assert authority. Coronations were theatrical events meant to convey legitimacy and invoke divine sanction. Papal councils and imperial diets were occasions for spectacle and lawmaking alike, places where authority was performed as much as declared. Control over these rituals meant control over cultural narratives about who ruled and why. The role of women in this history is often overlooked, yet women like Matilda of Tuscany played crucial parts. Matilda, a powerful noblewoman and staunch papal ally, provided military and political support to Gregory VII and the Reform cause, and her holdings in central Italy were pivotal during the imperial-papal conflicts. Her influence illustrates how noble women could exercise significant power as landholders, patrons, and arbiters of alliances, shaping the course of the dispute in ways that formal histories sometimes understate. Moving further into the later Middle Ages, the papacy sought to consolidate its spiritual jurisdiction through councils and legal codifications while maintaining an international network of influence. Papal legates traveled as emissaries, resolving disputes and asserting Rome's directives. The institutionalization of these practices reflected the papacy's ongoing attempt to create a pan-European ecclesiastical governance that could transcend local political fragmentation, even as the reality on the ground increasingly resisted central control. We must not forget the cultural consequences. Art, architecture, and liturgy all bore traces of the papal-imperial contest. Churches were embellished to signal spiritual authority. Liturgical formulations emphasized the pope's primacy or regional rights autonomy. Poetry and chronicles narrated the deeds of emperors and popes, shaping public memory. In these cultural productions, claims about sacred power were given shape and rhythm that ordinary people could apprehend and respond to. Another vital episode is the way that nations outside the empire viewed papal imperial struggles. The papacy's relations with France, England, and Spain were shaped by the shifting balance of power in the empire, and vice versa. French kings often sought to limit papal influence within their own realms while leveraging the papacy to legitimize claims against the empire. England's ecclesiastical policy under Henry II and later monarchs was colored by concerns about papal intervention, and Spain's close alliance with the papacy in the 15th and 16th centuries reflected a different set of interests tied to colonial expansion and confessional unity. The colonial expansion of European powers also made papal decisions and imperial responses global affairs. Papal bulls that granted missionary rights or territorial claims in the Americas were not abstract documents, they had practical consequences for how empires projected authority overseas. Emperors and kings used papal endorsement to justify conquest and colonization, and these actions intertwined ecclesiastical authority with imperial ambition in a new, global register. Throughout all these shifts, the language of legitimacy remained central. Emperors sought coronations because public ritual and divine sanction were still essential to the perception of rule. popes provided or withheld recognition because their endorsement conferred a moral halo that could influence rebellious subjects or wavering allies. Even when the papal role diminished in practical governance, the symbolic power of recognition, excommunication, and canonization retained moral force that rulers could neither ignore nor entirely control. The medieval conflict also stimulated administrative innovations. As bishops and abbots became integral to secular governance, the need for clearer legal procedures and bureaucratic record-keeping intensified. Chanceries matured, notaries proliferated, and documents such as charters and letters patent became instruments of governance and proof. These innovations in record-keeping and legal formalization outlived the medieval struggle and provided tools for modern statecraft and church administration alike. One should not overlook the theological stakes. The debate over investiture touched questions about the nature of priesthood, the sacraments, and the relationship between earthly and heavenly authorities. The Reformers argued that clerical office was a sacramental trust, whose efficacy could be compromised by secular taint. Opponents countered that faith and order required the cooperation of temporal power to maintain peace and provide for the material needs of the Church. These theological debates reverberated through sermons, theological treatises, and pastoral care, influencing how people understood salvation and governance. The role of canon law in this story was decisive. The compilation of canonical texts and the emergence of trained jurists provided the papacy with a legal arsenal to assert its claims and to regulate ecclesiastical life. Canonists articulated principles of ecclesiastical autonomy and developed procedures for resolving disputes that bolstered papal arguments. Their work created a legal language that connected theology with administrative practice, making the papacy's claims harder to dismiss as mere rhetoric. Yet the legalism had limits because enforcement depended on political power. A pope could issue a binding decretal, but if he lacked the military or diplomatic means to compel obedience, his decrees could be ignored or resisted. Conversely, emperors who lacked moral legitimacy risked losing the allegiance of subjects who placed spiritual authority above political calculations. In short, the papal imperial contest was as much about enforcement capacity as it was about abstract doctrines. As the narrative proceeds into the Renaissance and early modern eras, the interplay between humanist culture and church politics matters. Renaissance popes patronized artists, architects, and scholars, reinventing Rome as a center of Christian humanism that projected soft power across Europe. Emperors and kings sought to emulate this cultural magnetism, sponsoring courts of learning and artistic excellence. The rhetorical battle between papal splendor and princely grandeur became another battlefield on which claims of authority were made visible. The Reformation intensified the stakes for both pope and emperor because it turned every ecclesiastical question into a potential political fracture. Protestant princes seized the opportunity to assert independence from Rome, while Catholic rulers sought to rally forces against perceived heresy. The papacy's efforts to coordinate a Catholic response, through councils, confraternities, and the eventual Counter-Reformation, had to contend with the decentralized nature of imperial politics and the sovereign prerogatives of territorial princes. The Council of Trent and the Catholic Reformation reinforced papal doctrinal authority and renewed ecclesiastical discipline, but they did not magically restore papal political primacy. Instead, the Counter-Reformation created new forms of spiritual mobilization, such as the Jesuit order, which became agents of influence in courts and colonies. The papacy thereby gained renewed momentum in cultural and missionary terms, even as its political tools remained constrained by the realities of modern statecraft. Diplomatic practice evolved in response to the altered balance of power. Permanent embassies and resident diplomats, originally developed in Italian city-states, became standard instruments for communications between Rome and European courts. Popes, emperors, and kings learned to negotiate through ambassadors, crafting treaties and concordats that reflected mutual interests. These diplomatic channels allowed the papacy to maintain influence by bargaining over bishops' appointments, ecclesiastical immunities, and the jurisdictional scope of church courts. As nation-states matured, concordats, the formal agreements between the Vatican and secular rulers, became mechanisms to regulate the Church's role within a realm. These pacts often addressed the very concerns that lay at the heart of the medieval dispute: who appointed bishops, how church property was taxed, and what immunities clergy enjoyed. Concordats demonstrated that the medieval conflict had become a normal part of statecraft, negotiated not in the form of moral crusades but as diplomatic compromises reflecting particular balances of power. The role of the university must also be mentioned because medieval and early modern scholars debated the merits and limits of papal and imperial claims in classrooms and legal schools. Universities produced jurists, theologians, and canonists who advised popes and princes alike. Intellectual currents flowing from these institutions provided the conceptual tools for both sides: arguments about divine right, natural law, and contractual sovereignty all found expression in academic treatises before being tested in realpolitik. The use of spiritual sanctions remained significant even in the age of diplomacy. Excommunication or interdict could still damage reputations, disrupt alliances, and provide moral cover for political actions. However, their efficacy depended on broader social acceptance. Where local churches and communities no longer recognized papal authority, such sanctions were weakened. Thus, the practical power of spiritual penalties waxed and waned with the social and political context in which they were invoked. The empire's decentralized character also fostered cultural pluralism. German lands, Italian city-states, and Burgundian territories developed distinct legal and social customs that complicated any attempt at universal governance by papacy or empire. This multiplicity made it harder for either center to formulate a one-size-fits-all policy and required both popes and emperors to adapt to a patchwork of local traditions. The necessity of local adaptation undercut the medieval model of a uniform, Christian polity under singular spiritual and temporal authorities. One of the ironies of the longue durée is that reforms intended to free the Church from secular contamination also contributed to the proliferation of ecclesiastical polities that would resist imperial centralization. By empowering bishops and monastic institutions to hold lands and exercise jurisdiction independently, reform movements had the unintended consequence of creating ecclesiastical actors who could serve as counterweights to the emperor. The very attempt to purify the Church expanded the number of political players within the empire. The late medieval and early modern periods demonstrate how closely religious and cultural narratives shaped political legitimacy. Saints, relics, and holy sites provided focal points of devotion that bishops and popes could harness to assert influence. Pilgrimages and cults of saints were forms of popular religion that connected communities to larger ecclesiastical networks. The papacy's command over liturgical calendars and the recognition of saints were, in effect, instruments of soft power that influenced piety and political loyalties alike. The papal-imperial relationship also had economic dimensions. Church lands and ecclesiastical revenues were significant parts of the medieval economy, and disputes over taxation, feudal dues, and jurisdiction affected fiscal policy. Princes who sought to expand their treasuries often clashed with clerical privileges that exempted church property from certain taxes. Conversely, rulers sometimes relied on church loans, clerical administrators, and ecclesiastical courts to manage fiscal and judicial affairs, intertwining economic interests with political debates about authority. The legacy of the investiture controversy extends to how modern states conceptualize the separation of church and state. While medieval Europe never knew a neat division, the long conflict contributed to a trajectory in which secular authorities gradually assumed prerogatives once held by church institutions. Over centuries, functions like registry of births, marriages, deaths, education, and legal governance moved increasingly into the secular domain, altering the public role of the church and redefining its relationship with political authority. Intellectual developments in the early modern period crystallized new theories of sovereignty that would eventually challenge papal claims in decisive ways. Thinkers elaborated notions of popular consent, natural rights, and the social contract, providing arguments for the legitimacy of state power that did not rest on ecclesiastical endorsement. These ideas undergirded the growing confidence of territorial rulers who asserted jurisdictional supremacy within their states and negotiated agreements with the papacy from a position of strength. The Enlightenment's critique of clerical privilege further eroded the moral authority of the papacy in many northern and central European states. Secular reformers attacked monastic wealth, argued for civil marriage, and sought to curtail clerical immunities. Popes resisted, sometimes forging coalitions with Catholic monarchs, but the intellectual tide had shifted. Public opinion and elite discourse increasingly favored rational administration over ecclesiastical prerogatives. When we reach the moment of the empire's dissolution, it is important to see it as the culmination of many linked tendencies: the steady disentanglement of spiritual and temporal authority, the fragmentation of political sovereignty, the rise of national churches, and the transformation of diplomacy and law. The papacy survived as a spiritual institution and as a player in international affairs, but the medieval dream of a single Christian commonwealth under papal and imperial guidance had become untenable in a world of emerging nation-states and modern bureaucracies. The dissolution had consequences for the papacy that were both physical and symbolic. While popes continued to claim universal spiritual authority, their capacity to enforce political claims shrank. Romantic and nationalist movements later in the 19th century further complicated the papacy's role as new movements for Italian unification and secularization confronted papal temporal possessions. The papal loss of the Papal States in the 19th century finalized a secular order that medieval popes could scarcely have imagined. At the same time, the medieval contest left institutional traces that would survive into modernity. Concordats, canon law, and the diplomatic role of the Vatican are legacies of the centuries in which church and empire negotiated authority. The moral rhetoric developed during the investiture controversy about the purity of clerical office and the need for spiritual autonomy influenced later Catholic reform movements and informed the Church's internal self-understanding long after emperors were gone. The cultural memory of the controversy also matters. For centuries, historians, chroniclers, and novelists have retold the drama of Gregory and Henry, of Canassa's snow, and of the Concordat of Worms. These narratives have shaped modern perceptions of medieval Europe as an age of spiritual fervor and political theater. The imagery of Pope and Emperor locked in moral and political combat remains potent because it encapsulates profound questions about authority that societies still grapple with today. Even the architecture of Europe preserves the story. Cathedrals, abbeys, and the ruins of imperial palaces bear witness to contests over patronage, wealth, and prestige. The ribbed vaults and flying buttresses of Gothic cathedrals express a commitment to religious ideals that fueled papal moral claims, while imperial palaces and civic buildings in German towns speak to the local authorities who resisted distant power. Walking through these stones, one senses the layered negotiations of centuries in which sacral and civic pride competed and collaborated. Finally, the story teaches us that institutions adapt. The papacy transformed from a medieval moral arbiter with direct political instruments into an institution that wielded moral influence, diplomatic skill, and cultural authority. The Holy Roman Empire shifted from an ambitious attempt to reconstitute Roman universality into a mosaic of principalities with complex legal ties and ceremonial connections. The long tug-of-war between Pope and Emperor did not end neatly. It evolved into a new European order in which the language of sovereignty, the practice of diplomacy, and the reach of ecclesiastical authority were forever altered. When we look back across a millennium of conflict, compromise, and cultural change, we see that the struggles between the Holy Roman Emperors and the papacy were not simply battles for offices or lands. There were existential debates about how Christian society should be ordered, whether authority derived primarily from spiritual consecration or from temporal governance, how law should mediate between sacred and secular obligations, and who could claim the authority to define public morality. These debates shaped institutions, laws, and hearts for centuries and left a complex inheritance that still informs our modern sense of church and state. The investiture controversy and its aftermath were thus both a matter of high politics and a set of lived realities. They influenced the development of legal thought, diplomatic practice, and administrative structures. They altered the balance between central and local authority, and they shaped popular religion and everyday life. The narrative of popes and emperors is, in effect, a narrative about the formation of Europe itself, a long negotiation over power, faith, and the meaning of legitimate rule. In the end, the story of the Holy Roman Empire's struggles with the papacy is a reminder that power is rarely absolute and rarely simple. It moves through ceremonies and documents, through alliances and betrayals, through the sermons of reformers and the proclamations of rulers. It is mediated by institutions that adapt, by personalities that clash, and by peoples who live under the shadow of decisions made in distant palaces and curiae. The saga offers us a mirror in which to reflect on the perennial tensions between conscience and command, between spiritual ideals and political necessity. And so, as we finish this long journey through 1,000 years of history, we leave behind more than a sequence of events. We carry with us a sense of how deeply faith and power interwove to produce the medieval and early modern worlds. The investiture controversy and the broader struggles between Pope and Emperor did not merely answer historical questions, they posed enduring ones about legitimacy, community, and the moral authority that underpins political life. Those questions continue to echo, reminding us that the past remains an active conversation partner for the present. The story of the Holy Roman Empire reads like a long, slow-moving epic, a palimpsest of kings and popes, banners and trees, towns rising from marsh and forest, and dynasties that burned bright and then faded or were cut down by intrigue. To understand its high point under the Hohenstaufen dynasty, we first need to picture the stage on which they performed, a Europe still recovering from the shocks of the first millennium and reorganizing itself around new political realities. The empire they inherited was not a tidy kingdom with a single central authority, but a mosaic of duchies, bishoprics, free cities, and lordships held together by a memory of Roman imperial dignity and a fragile network of feudal loyalty. That memory mattered. The idea of empire gave kings a claim to universal authority that they themselves would continuously redefine by force of law, marriage, war, and ceremony. When the Hohenstaufen line entered history, it was already the third great attempt to build a German-centered imperial order since Charlemagne, following the Saxon and Salian houses. The Hohenstaufen emerged from Swabia, a territory carved by rivers and hills, where a family castle near Göppingen lent them a name and a sense of rootedness. Their ascent was not inevitable. It was hammered out in battles and bargains, marriages and assassinations, in which the Welfs offered a fierce counterweight and the papacy watched every movement as if counting beads in a rosary. The early Hohenstaufen kings would always be navigating three great terrains at once: the German duchies, Papal Rome, and the endlessly fractious municipalities of northern Italy. Conrad III, the first Hohenstaufen to wear the lance of kingship, set the tone by inheriting conflict and by learning how to live with it. His reign in the mid-12th century was a patchwork of military expeditions and diplomatic maneuvers, an education for the dynasty about the limits of royal power in Germany and the dangerous allure of Italy. Conrad could not fashion a strong centralized state because the principalities had grown too powerful, and because the memory of the emperor was often more persuasive than the emperor himself. Still, his difficulties taught his successors to think bigger and to imagine a monarchy that would command not just loyalty but also institutions. From Conrad's uneasy seat of power rose Frederick I, who history would call Barbarossa, a name that meant red beard and carried with it the weight of legend. He was a ruler of vision and impatience, the sort who believed that kingship demanded grandeur and that grandeur required action in northern Italy, where city communes were asserting independence and where the papacy stood as both spiritual authority and political rival. Barbarossa's campaigns across the Alps were demonstrations of imperial intent. He wanted to bring Milan and other Lombard communes into an orderly hierarchy under imperial law. Those campaigns were also a test of medieval logistics, an exercise in moving men, horses, and siege engines through hostile country with supply lines that could be cut by rivulets and flanking ambushes. The clash with the northern Italian communes birthed one of the defining conflicts of the age and produced a new kind of political alliance, the Lombard League, which knitted together cities like Milan, Cremona, and Piacenza into a resistance that could rival princely arms. At Legnano, in 1176, imperial glory met municipal discipline and improvisation, and Barbarossa suffered a symbolic defeat that would reverberate through the centuries. The emperor's legendary response was not mere pride wounded, it was a strategic recalibration that led to the Peace of Constance in 1183. Where a kind of uneasy coexistence replaced blunt conquest. The treaty recognized a complex balance, imperial overlordship in name and ritual, but local autonomy in practice that allowed communes to govern their daily affairs, collect taxes, and field militias without direct imperial oversight. Barbarossa's diplomacy was as crucial as his victories and his defeats, and he knew that kingship required more than banners. He cultivated relationships with dukes and bishops, he presided at imperial diets where law and privilege were discussed and recorded, and he sought the pageantry of coronation in Rome to lend sacred legitimacy to his crown. Yet Rome was never simply a site for ceremony, it was a theater of power where emperors and popes staged their rival claims. This was a world in which the handshake and the crusader's vow might be two faces of the same instrument of policy, where a treaty signed in an abbey could be as binding as a fortress seized by force. When Henry VI succeeded his father, Barbarossa, the Hohenstaufen moment entered a new register of ambition. Henry's marriage to Constance of Sicily brought the richest Mediterranean kingdom into the dynasty's orbit and expanded imperial horizons to include southern Italy and Sicily with their Arabiaized courts, cultivated cities, and long-standing legal traditions. That marriage offered a chance at unprecedented consolidation, a north-south axis from the German duchies to the Sicilian throne. A union that promised to make the empire more than a confederation of nobles and cities and to transform it into a Transalpine empire. Henry's sudden death in 1197 cut those plans short and plunged the dynasty into dynastic struggle, but the idea of a unified imperial realm had taken a deep root. The assassination and accidental deaths that followed Henry VI's departure split the Hohenstaufen house with wealth rivals and the papacy maneuvering for advantage, producing a period of internecine war in which rival princes and pretenders fought for the imperial mantle. Philip of Swabia, a Hohenstaufen claimant, faced off against Otto of Brunswick, a Welf, in a contest that was less a binary duel than a network of shifting loyalties involving bishops, cities, and foreign courts. The stakes were not only the crown, they were the right to appoint archbishops, to extract taxes, to impose justice, and to negotiate marriages whose reach could determine loyalties for generations. The assassination of Philip in 1208 altered the trajectory of the dynasty and opened a space that would allow the plant of imperial ambition to change its shape under new hands. From the chaos of contests and murders, a figure emerged who would again redefine the empire in startling ways: Frederick II, son of Henry VI and perhaps the most enigmatic sovereign of the medieval West. Born and largely raised in Sicily, Frederick grew up in a court that was a cultural crossroads, where Greek, Latin, Arabic, and Norman influences met and mingled. He was as comfortable in the philosophical debates of Arabic scholars as he was in the ceremonial halls of Christendom, a ruler whose curiosity extended from legal codes to natural science, from falconry to poetry. His reign would be a study in contrasts, an imperial cosmopolitanism that clashed with papal suspicion, a legalizing drive that met feudal fragmentation, and a brilliance that made enemies as surely as it made allies. Frederick II's rule thrust the empire into the broader Mediterranean world in ways his predecessors had only hinted at. He saw Sicily as more than a subsidy. He saw it as the administrative center of a state that could rival any in Europe, with a professional bureaucracy, a written constitution, and a cultivated court. The constitutions of Melfi, promulgated in 1231, exemplified his effort to systematize law, to assert royal authority over nobles and clergy, and to create a legal unity that would serve as the spine of governance. At the same time, he encouraged scholars, commissioned translations of Arabic works, and protected a court where poets and scientists could engage with each other in a kind of renaissance before the word existed. This intellectual and bureaucratic fledgling state enraged and fascinated the papacy in equal measure. Popes feared the possibility of an emperor who could command armies and courts across the breadth of Italy, whose authority might eclipse the Church's temporal claims or whose jurisdictional reach could swallow papal prerogatives. From Gregory IX onward, papal responses ranged from cautious diplomacy to open excommunication. The conflict was rarely simply spiritual. It was about taxation, legal supremacy, feudal obligations, and the right to anoint rulers. Frederick's frequent absences from Germany in order to conduct affairs in Italy and the Mediterranean compounded the anxieties of German princes who felt their king was becoming a southern monarch with distant interests. Frederick's entanglement with crusading vows offers a window onto his singular mind and the odd mixture of piety and pragmatism that defined his reign. Instead of leading a sword-driven crusade like those before him, he negotiated, bartered, and signed a treaty in 1229 that yielded control of Jerusalem without fighting a pitched battle. To some contemporaries, this diplomatic retrieval of Christian holy places was a masterstroke, to others a betrayal of chivalric expectation. The episode illustrated Frederick's preference for intelligence, negotiation, and logistics over the thunder of charge lines. It also deepened the papal conviction that a Hohenstaufen emperor would always be a political problem if left unchecked. In Germany, the Hohenstaufen kings grappled with the slow accretion of princely power and the new assertiveness of towns that were changing the social and economic map of the region. Trade routes through the North Sea and the Baltic created wealth, and the merchant communes that organized commerce demanded rights and privileges which they often won through charters. That wealth underwrote the growth of urban culture, guilds, markets, cathedrals that rose on stone foundations, and a civic language of negotiation with the nobility. The Hohenstaufen princes tried to harness these developments, sometimes granting privileges to cities to secure support and sometimes seeking to curb their autonomy when it threatened military logistics or tax collection. The empire under the Hohenstaufen was a crucible of institutional invention even when central authority was weak. The diets where princes and bishops met became stages for bargaining, where imperial laws were proclaimed and exemptions negotiated, where the idea of a Reich developed in practice if not in centralized enforcement. The king's chancery produced writs and charters that circulated authority in ink and wax, enabling a form of governance that relied on written instruments and the prestige of legal form. Alongside this, ministerials, the unfree knights and administrators bound to the court and the major lords, provided a flexible instrument of power, a professionalized service class that could be deployed as soldiers, stewards, or officials in a way that blurred the lines of feudal hierarchy. Culturally, the Hohenstaufen era is often remembered as a golden age of courtly sophistication, of mini-sang and troubadour lyric, of a revival in the arts that drew on diverse Mediterranean influences. Poets like Walther von der Vogelweide sang the virtues of chivalry even as they criticized corrupt lords, and courtly romances transformed ideas of love, honor, and the role of the individual in a martial society. The architecture of the period fused Romanesque solidity with emergent Gothic lightness, as churches and cathedrals grew taller and more ornamented, their stones telling stories in sculpture and stained glass. Monastic reform and the rise of new religious orders like the Cistercians also reshaped spiritual life and land management, producing agricultural innovations and a new ethos of piety that competed with the secular court. Militarily, the period witnessed both the refinement of knightly warfare and the growing importance of siegecraft and logistics, technologies that made the capture of fortified towns and castles a matter of engineering as much as courage. Castles proliferated as symbols of lordly power and as practical tools of governance, each perched to control a road, a river, or a valley. The use of mercenaries increased, and so did the bureaucratic needs of feeding and equipping men at arms, which in turn pushed rulers toward more systematic taxation and administration. The very demands of warfare pushed the medieval polity to keep records, to formalize obligations, and to think in terms of supply chains long before the phrase existed. Frederick II's personal court at Palermo was one of the most remarkable political laboratories of the Middle Ages, a place where the Mediterranean was condensed into a single capital and where governance drew on Norman, Byzantine, and Islamic precedents. He patronized translators, collected medical texts, and assembled an administrative apparatus that employed not just German knights but Greek-speaking administrators and Muslim officials who knew tax systems and irrigation. This practical cosmopolitanism offended many in northern Christendom who saw Sicily as an alien, even heretical court, and it became an argument in the papal campaign to depict Frederick as a threat to Christian norms. Yet from the standpoint of administrative innovation, Sicily stood as a model for what a coherent state might be: written law, centralized tax collection, and a standing bureaucratic spine. The dramas of papal conflict crescendoed into a series of excommunications and political maneuvers aimed at detaching German princes from Frederick's authority and at undermining his Sicilian base. At the heart of the dispute lay the ancient question of the proper bounds of ecclesiastical and royal power, but it also involved land, money, and the personal enmities of powerful men. Popes saw opportunity in allying with rebellious princes or supporting rival claimants. Emperors saw the papacy's alliances as interventions that weakened imperial unity. These were not merely theological contests, but high-stakes political games in which spiritual censures could be used as weapons with real temporal consequences. The Hohenstaufen's entanglement with crusading goals and Mediterranean politics also led to an expanding vision of empire that threatened to redraw the map of power in Europe. Frederick's ambitions for a cross-Mediterranean realm with Sicily at its heart threatened the Papal States and worried French and English kings who feared a continental hegemon with Mediterranean reach. The dynasty's alliances and marriages stretched across Europe, creating familial claims that could be levered into political advantage, but also creating a web of enemies. The very scale of Hohenstaufen aspiration produced a coalition of opponents that could never be defeated by force alone and required a long strategy of negotiation, propaganda, and, sometimes, assassination. Assassination and sudden death shadowed the Hohenstaufen narrative, turning brilliant plans into unfinished architectures of power. The premature deaths of heirs, the stabbing of princes, the poisoning or suspicious illness that took capable rulers all poisoned the potential continuity of the dynasty's projects. The deaths of Frederick II and his heir, coupled with the rise of powerful regional magnates, brought the dynasty to a breaking point and invited the long-period historians call the Great Interregnum. Suddenly, the imperial title became a prize contested by many rather than an anchor of centralized governance, and the dream of a unified empire retreated into a memory and a litany of failed plans. During the interregnum, the empire splintered further as regional rulers entrenched themselves and as cities claimed freedoms that the Hohenstaufen had tried to limit. The archbishops and prince-bishops became quasi-sovereigns in their territories, the duchies asserted ancient rights, and free imperial cities formed leagues to protect trade and mutual liberties. This centrifugal force had been building during the Hohenstaufen period. The dynasty's efforts at centralization often ran up against a social and economic momentum toward local autonomy. The result was not mere chaos, but an administrative pluralism in which overlapping rights and jurisdictions required increasingly complex negotiation and legalism. Legally, this era seeded institutions that would long outlive dynasties, because law proved more durable than dynastic sword play. The revival of Roman law at universities like Bologna fed into a stream of juridical thought that princes and lawyers could use to justify claims or to build new states. The chancery writs, the imperial diets, the charters of cities, and the codifications of royal law all created a corpus that could be cited, argued, and enforced in courts. In time, the language of law and the tools of bureaucratic governance became the medium through which power was exercised, and this would shape the late medieval and early modern trajectories of the German lands. The ending of Hohenstaufen preeminence did not mark the end of their influence, for ideas have a longer half-life than crowns. Their administrative experiments, legal innovations, and cultural patronage persisted in practice and in memory, passed down to subsequent rulers who borrowed their symbols and adapted their institutions. The image of the Hohenstaufen as imperial builders informed later attempts to revive imperial dignity, and their legends were woven into the tapestry of medieval memory. Even in defeat, their model of rulership, ambitious, centralized, and learned, left a template for what empire might be, and for that reason their shadow stretched into the policies of later dynasties. Culturally, the Hohenstaufen period has been romanticized and mythologized in later centuries, particularly in the 19th century when nationalists looked to the medieval empire for symbols to bind disparate regions into imagined unities. Frederick Barbarossa became a sleeping hero in some Germanic legends, imagined as a king who would one day awaken and bring unity. Writers and artists reinterpreted Hohenstaufen motifs, sometimes obscuring the messy realities of fealty and finance in favor of noble myths. These appropriations tell us more about later centuries' desires for legitimation than about the century itself, but they also show how enduring the imperial image proved. The economic story of the Hohenstaufen era is one of transformation rather than simple growth, because trade and money reconfigured relationships of power in ways that undermined some aspects of feudalism while empowering others. Monetary circulation increased, urban markets expanded, and long-distance trade found new arteries through the Hanseatic League and Italian merchants. Nobles who could not adapt to these monetary economies found their traditional power eroded, but many noble houses converted land rents into cash rents and integrated merchant wealth into their own finances. The growth of towns created new social groups, merchants, artisans, guilds, who demanded legal recognition and whose bargaining power reshaped the public sphere. Religion remained central to the political identity of the empire even as secular administration developed with new sophistication. Bishops and abbots were not merely spiritual leaders but key political actors who controlled land, levied soldiers, and sat in diets, often swaying the balance of power. Monastic orders shaped both the spiritual life and the economy, introducing innovations in agriculture and record-keeping that improved productivity. The Church's moral claims gave it leverage in conflicts over jurisdiction and property, and the Pope's ability to excommunicate a king or release subjects from their oaths was a real political instrument, not merely a theological pronouncement. The architecture of authority during the Hohenstaufen age relied on rituals that dramatized the emperor's power, coronations in Rome, ceremonial entries into cities, symbolic investitures, and the display of regalia. These spectacles were necessary because the emperor's power depended on recognition, and recognition required public performance. Processions and oaths made abstract claims tangible. When a duke swore fealty in public, he was creating a political reality that could be later enforced or contested in court. Even when real control was limited, the pageantry maintained a lexicon of imperial legitimacy that could be revived by shrewd rulers. Diplomacy during this period acquired a new vocabulary and a new professionalism as rulers learned that marriages, treaties, and hostages could achieve what armies could not. Dynastic marriages like Henry VI's union with the Sicilian heiress were instruments of territorial expansion that carried legal weight in claims and successions. Ambassadors traveled, not as ceremonial guests only, but as agents who negotiated trade agreements, marriage contracts, and peace treaties, and who carried back detailed intelligence. Those practices refined the art of statecraft and helped create networks of mutual recognition that could be mobilized in times of crisis. Art and learning in the Hohenstaufen courts fed off contact with Byzantium and the Muslim world, bringing new texts and scientific knowledge into Latin Christendom and enriching intellectual life. The translation movements of Sicily and southern Italy transmitted Aristotle and medical treatises that would later be read in the universities. This cross-cultural fertilization was not merely an elite curiosity, it ultimately shaped curricula in emerging universities and influenced the scholastic project of reconciling reason and faith. As a result, the intellectual legacy of the Hohenstaufen court reached into theology, law, and natural science for centuries. The rise of chronicles and the increasing self-consciousness of writers also meant that rulers became more concerned with legacy, with how their deeds would be recorded and remembered. Court chroniclers wrote in Latin about battles and treaties, but they also composed narratives that portrayed rulers in moral and providential terms, shaping later interpretations. Genealogies were made elaborate and sometimes invented to provide a sense of continuity and legitimacy, and monuments were erected to enshrine reputations. All of these practices helped construct the medieval political imagination in ways that would be reclaimed or contested by subsequent generations. The decline of Hohenstaufen rule brought about political experimentation among German princes, who tried new forms of alliances and administrative arrangements to fill the vacuum of central authority. Electoral practices evolved into a more formalized system where a small group of princes claimed the right to choose the king, an innovation that both curtailed and structured royal power. While the definitive codification of the Electoral College came later, the practices that would culminate in it were taking shape during and immediately after the Hohenstaufen period. The diffusion of power had the paradoxical effect of making the office more dependent on consensus and negotiation, thereby institutionalizing the very fragmentation that it sought to restrain. The military technologies and tactics of the era were not static, and the diffusion of heavier cavalry, crossbows, and more sophisticated artillery reshaped sieges and pitched battles. Fortified towns adapted, employing thick walls and concentric defenses that prolonged sieges and made the capture of cities an endeavor of months rather than mere days. These defensive investments required financial resources, which in turn forced rulers to think about broader fiscal policies and the taxation necessary to support both war and governance. Thus, military developments were intimately linked to the rise of bureaucratic sophistication. Language and legal practice also evolved under pressure from these complex social changes, as vernaculars like Middle High German began to appear in poetry and eventually in legal documents that had once been the sole preserve of Latin. The growing use of vernacular languages in law and literature widened political participation and created a shared cultural space among lay audiences. Legal vernacularization helped towns articulate communal rights and made law more accessible to those who needed it most, merchants and craftsmen who could now read the statutes that governed their lives. This linguistic shift democratized, in a limited sense, the tools of authority and negotiation. The Hohenstaufen were explorers of administrative space, trying to create durable institutions in an environment that resisted them, and in doing so they shaped the rhythms of European governance for generations. They were not all-powerful monarchs who imposed a uniform order. They were ambitious innovators whose policies created ripple effects across law, urban life, culture, and war. Their failures were as instructive as their successes because they revealed the limits of medieval kingship and the resilience of local autonomy. In the ruins of their projects, one can see the bones of later states and the outlines of the modern political map of Central Europe. To the people who lived through these centuries, the empire must have felt both overpowering and diffuse, a distant majesty that broke into daily life through taxes, conscription, or the presence of an itinerant court. For nobles, it was a structure to be negotiated. For bishops, it was a source of both support and contention. And for towns, it offered both protection and constraints. The Hohenstaufen sought to align these various interests under an imperial aegis, sometimes by force and sometimes by law, and their mixed results reveal how medieval politics required persistent bargaining rather than single decisive solutions. Even their most spectacular policy achievements were often compromises clothed in the language of victory. The symbolism fostered by Hohenstaufen rulers, banners, coinage, seals, was a tool for creating cohesion across disparate territories, allowing a king to make a visual claim to loyalty in markets and courts. Coins bearing the imperial effigy circulated through towns and villages, reinforcing the idea of a ruler whose authority extended beyond his immediate presence. Seals authenticated documents and ensured that charters carried weight in distant parts of the realm, making written instruments a form of governance that could be deployed anywhere. These tangible symbols of rule were small but powerful ways of fashioning a common imperial identity. Women of the Hohenstaufen courts played crucial roles in diplomacy and patronage, even as their actions are often less documented than their male counterparts. Queens and duchesses arranged marriages, managed estates, and in some cases acted as regents, bridging generations and stabilizing transitions. Their households were centers of cultural production and political networking, and their patronage could elevate poets, artists, and clerics who in turn shaped public opinion. Although medieval sources often diminish their public role, the fabric of Hohenstaufen governance was stitched in many places by women's labor and influence. The road to the Hohenstaufen high point was paved with legal and military precedents from earlier kings and reinvented by their successors, and this cumulative process reminds us that empire was an evolving art rather than a static institution. Each monarch added a layer, new laws, new alliances, new ceremonies, and those accretions produced the late medieval political landscape. The Hohenstaufen were architects of many such layers, and even in collapse their blueprints influenced the architecture of power that came after. To read their reign is to read an experiment in statecraft, performed across time and terrain and through institutions both fragile and durable. Historians have debated endlessly whether the Hohenstaufen might have succeeded in forging a durable centralized empire had luck and longevity favored them, or whether the centrifugal forces of geography, feudal custom, and church power made such centralization impossible. Both arguments have merit because the period shows a tension between possibility and structure, between ambitious policy and entrenched practice. The dynasty's successes suggest that with the right confluence of heirs and political stability, centralized authority could have gained ground. Yet the persistent autonomy of principalities and cities suggests limits that no single dynasty, however skilled, might easily overcome. In the end, the Hohenstaufen legacy is not a neat ledger of wins and losses, but a palimpsest of experiments and models that others would read and adapt. Their legal codifications, their cosmopolitan court, their diplomatic ingenuity, and their spectacular failures all contributed to a medieval political imagination that continued to shape Europe. Later rulers would borrow their techniques of administration, their aesthetics of court, and their legal precedents to stitch together realms that, while different, bore a familial resemblance to Hohenstaufen ambitions. Memory, law, and culture proved as enduring as fortresses and coins, carrying their mark forward. That legacy also contains a cautionary tale about the dangers of overreaching and the political cost of alienating powerful intermediaries like bishops and dukes. The Hohenstaufen often succeeded by centralizing power, but sometimes overreached in ways that provoked concerted resistance, reminding us that medieval kingship required the careful management of many autonomous actors. The balance of coercion and consent was delicate, and the Hohenstaufen strategies show both the power of persuasive law and the limits of royal command. Their history teaches us that political genius must be matched with resilient institutions if it is to be lasting. The Holy Roman Empire under their sway became a laboratory for experimenting with the very idea of what an empire should be, a legal entity, a cultural beacon, and a theater of power that could not be reduced to a single province. The dynasts who wore the imperial crown were test pilots for something larger than themselves, attempting to bind North and South, Latinate and Germanic traditions, urban liberty and royal authority. They often failed to seal the bargain, but their attempts produced administrative tools and cultural legacies that endured. In that sense, their high point was both a zenith and a turning point for medieval Europe. As the medieval centuries unfolded into later epochs, the Hohenstaufen era remained a reference point for political thinkers, legal scholars, and artists who found in its mixture of grandeur and fracture a useful mirror for their own time. Renaissance jurists, early modern princes, and modern nationalists each read different things into the Hohenstaufen inheritance, appropriating what suited their agenda. This shifting reception history shows how the past is always a resource for present needs, and how medieval dynasties can be repurposed for arguments that would have been unrecognizable to their contemporaries. The empire's story thus continued to be told and retold, growing layers of meaning beyond the immediate actions of its kings. Listening across the centuries, it becomes clear that the Hohenstaufen high point was less a single luminous instant than a long accord of policy, culture, and contest that reshaped Europe in subtle and lasting ways. Their blend of administrative innovation, cultural patronage, and martial ambition created patterns others would imitate and resist, and these dialectics helped define the late medieval order. To follow their story is to watch institutions accrete, to see how law and ceremony can substitute for unambiguous force, and to feel the tension between universal claims and local realities. The Hohenstaufen taught Europe how to dream in imperial terms, and how costly such dreams could be. In the end, their era challenges us to think about power as a layered thing, crafted through words as well as swords, through written law as well as personal oath. What made the Hohenstaufen powerful was a capacity to imagine a polity that transcended parochial loyalties, and what made their decline possible was the equally strong force of rooted localities that refused to be fully subsumed. Their history is a study in the limits of ambition and the resourcefulness of institutions and peoples that guard their own liberties. It is a reminder that the making of empires is never simply a narrative of conquest, but a continuous negotiation with 1,000 intermediaries. If you are driving through landscapes that once knew Hohenstaufen banners, the stones under your wheels remember different sovereignties and shifting horizons, abbeys that charted time for peasants, market towns that kept accounts and ledgers, and city gates that opened to merchants from distant ports. Each village and cathedral is a small archive of the compromises and experiments that produced medieval life, an index of the many ways people adapted to, resisted, or benefited from imperial structures. The Hohenstaufen left physical traces, yes, in walls and palaces, but perhaps more importantly they left institutional traces in practices and legal forms that persisted long after their crowns were gone. Walking or driving those roads is to pass through history fashioned by both brilliant rulers and stubborn localities. Their saga is instructive for modern listeners because it shows how political communities are knitted together by law, ritual, and material practice rather than by abstract sovereignty alone. The Hohenstaufen sought unity through legal codification and centralized administration, but they had to negotiate everyday realities that were often more powerful than royal decrees. This tension between the aspiration for unity and the reality of diversity is not merely medieval, it echoes in contemporary debates about governance and subsidiarity. Studying their attempts illuminates how durable orders are built and how fragile they can be when consensus fractures. Looking back, the Hohenstaufen dynasty stands as both an emblem of medieval ambition and a cautionary tale about overconcentration of power without sufficient roots in local consent. Their achievements in law, culture, and administration altered Europe in ways that exceeded their lifetimes, yet their failures remind us of the practical limits of royal will. They were innovators who could harness scholars and soldiers alike to remold the polity, but they were also vulnerable to the very intermediaries who made rule possible. In this ambivalence lies their enduring fascination to historians and their dramatic potency for listeners. To the medieval mind, the emperor was meant to be the linchpin of Christendom, a secular complement to the spiritual authority of the pope, but this ideal rarely matched the political ground. The Hohenstaufen toyed with that ideal by asserting their imperial prerogatives, by styling themselves in Roman terms, and by competing with the papacy for influence over souls and lands. The result was a long series of constitutional experiments in which the boundaries between sacred and secular, local and imperial, were incessantly negotiated. Those negotiations produced a medieval world as we now imagine it, messy and magnificent in equal measure. And so the Hohenstaufen age offers a kind of meditation on power that is as readable in the texture of a legal charter as it is in the carving of a cathedral portal. Their regime relied on documents that could travel farther than men, on bureaucrats who would outlast battles, and on cultural patronage that made their courts nodes in a wider intellectual network. In the end, their most durable gifts might be less visible than their palaces and more profound than their titles: a bureaucratic language, a legal sensibility, and a cultural openness that pushed Europe into broader horizons. Those gifts would ripple through centuries, reappearing in later reforms and in the imagination of nations still forming. If the Hohenstaufen story refuses a tidy moral, it nevertheless teaches the listener to pay attention to the architecture of politics, to the rituals that make authority believable, to the written forms that carry claims into the future, and to the daily compromises that hold societies together. They remind us that institutions, once created, can take on lives of their own, that legal language can outlast dynasties, and that cultural exchange can transform courts and workshops alike. Their era is therefore not simply a historical curiosity but a reservoir of lessons about building, sustaining, and losing power. For anyone curious about how medieval Europe became the Europe we recognize, the Hohenstaufen are an indispensable chapter. Their downfall also invites reflection on the human costs of high medieval politics, wars that devastated lands, sieges that starved populations, and excommunications that divided communities spiritually and socially. Behind the grand narratives of treaty and coronation there were ordinary people who bore the brunt of princely quarrels, whose labor filled treasuries and whose sons fought in campaigns that might leave little for them at home. Remembering those human stories complicates the picture of dynastic genius and reminds us that political experiments have tangible effects on real lives. History, in this sense, must account for both the courts and the cottages if we wish to understand the full measure of an age. As the Middle Ages gave way to later centuries, the model of imperial rule the Hohenstaufen experimented with would be reinvented and contested by new players who adapted their techniques to different circumstances. The Habsburgs would eventually inherit the title of emperor, and they would use their own mix of marriage diplomacy, legal claims, and military campaigns to construct a different kind of trans-European power. Yet echoes of Hohenstaufen strategies remained, visible in the very notion of a ruler who claims to transcend regional boundaries by virtue of law and ceremony. In that continuity, the Hohenstaufen can be seen as midwives to later forms of sovereignty even as their own dynasty faded from the thrones. To listen to the Hohenstaufen story is to hear a chorus of competing claims and to appreciate how medieval rulers never governed alone but always in concert with a host of intermediaries, bishops, dukes, city councils, and foreign princes. Their high point was therefore not only about single-minded kings but about the capacity to align diverse actors behind a shared project. When alignment held, impressive feats were possible: legal codes, monumental architecture, and trans-Mediterranean diplomacy. When alignment failed, fragmentation followed, and the dream of a unified empire retreated into regional sovereignties. Finally, the Hohenstaufen epic reminds us that history is continually rewritten by those who come after, who find in past glories either a model to replicate or a caution to avoid. Their image as imperial builders was reshaped by chroniclers, poets, and later historians who highlighted different facets of their reign. The way we remember them says as much about later eras seeking legitimacy or identity as it does about the medieval rulers themselves. In listening to their story, we engage in a conversation across centuries, interpreting not just the facts of their reigns but the meanings that successive generations have found in their experiments with power. To listen to the long, slow arc of the Holy Roman Empire is to listen to a landscape of stone and speech, to the measured tolling of bells and the rustle of parchments, to markets and chancelleries, to the grinding wheels of law. The empire was not a single machine but a patchwork of machines that shared the same ground and often the same problems, each piece turning at its own speed while reliant on fragile and formal gears. By the late Middle Ages, this multiplicity of powers had become the defining feature, and the story that follows is one of fragmentation made permanent and of repeated attempts at reform that altered its shape but never quite welded it together. We begin where that story bends sharply, in the years after 1300, when crisis set forces in motion that would steer Central Europe for centuries. The old Carolingian ambitions had long since fragmented. What remained after Charlemagne and his heirs was a crown with shifting authority and a crown that depended on consent as much as on force. The emperors who bore the title of Holy Roman Emperor possessed a prestige that was both real and ceremonial. They could convene princes, summon armies, and confer privileges, but their reach into local affairs was often indirect, mediated by counts, bishops, cities, and guilds that guarded ancient liberties and new acquisitions with equal fervor. This decentralization had roots in feudal law, and the split between direct tenure under the emperor and layered lordship. Many rulers held lands that answered directly to the imperial crown, a legal condition called immediacy, which conferred a certain legal standing and a voice in imperial institutions. Around those immediate lords clustered other layers: mediate lords who owed allegiance to dukes or margraves, bishops who balanced spiritual duties with temporal power, and cities that prized their charters and the autonomy to regulate trade and craft. The result was an ecosystem of overlapping authorities that made sovereignty a negotiated status rather than a settled fact. By the later Middle Ages, the principal engines of fragmentation were clearer. Territorial princes consolidated power within their domains, extracting revenue, dispensing justice, and raising troops. Free imperial cities, from Nuremberg to Augsburg, developed civic identities and economic clout. Ecclesiastical principalities, led by prince-bishops and abbots, retained wealth and influence by blending pastoral duty with political maneuvering. These actors rarely sought to erase the imperial roof over their heads. More often they sought to maximize their freedom beneath it. That quest for autonomy, legal recognition, and local rule shaped both the melancholy and the energy of the late medieval empire. The legal and institutional attempts to hold this patchwork together were as telling as the divisions themselves. The imperial diet, or Reichstag, became the central forum where princes, prelates, and city envoys debated matters large and small. It was never a parliament in the modern sense, but it was a congress of estates, of corporate interests that deliberated in separate colleges and voted by groups. The emperor convened and presided, but the diet's power depended on negotiation. Its decisions required assent, and that need for assent made reform a laborious art of compromise. The late 14th and 15th centuries saw crucial innovations aimed at stabilizing this system. The Golden Bull of 1356 codified the process of electing the King of the Romans, naming 7 prince-electors and clarifying their privileges. It was a shorthand way to manage succession and to protect electoral prerogatives, but it also cemented the political autonomy of those electors. Later, in the 15th century, the institutions of imperial government were further retooled. The Diet of Worms in 1495 under Maximilian I introduced the idea of a perpetual public peace and established the Imperial Chamber Court, a judicial body intended to adjudicate disputes among the empire's estates and to limit private warfare. Those reforms had noble intentions and mixed results. The perpetual public peace sought to suppress the private feuds and feudal violence that had hindered commerce and law, yet enforcement depended on the same princes whose quarrels created the disorder. The Imperial Chamber Court created a legal avenue for appeals and disputes, and it helped generate a common legal language. But it was slow and expensive, and many litigants preferred local adjudication or the rough justice of armed might. Still, the expansion of legal institutions pointed to a broader impulse, the attempt to manufacture order out of fragmentation through law, ritual, and bureaucracy. Parallel to legal reform came administrative reorganization. The imperial circles, created in the early 16th century but rooted in earlier practices, divided the empire into regional groupings for defense, taxation, and the maintenance of the peace. These circles gathered princes, knights, and cities into cooperative bodies tasked with conscripting troops, policing highways, and collecting assessments. They were a partial answer to the problem of coordinating dozens of jurisdictions across vast territory, and they reflect how reformers sought to convert a mosaic of sovereignties into a functional network without altering fundamental prerogatives. Economic and demographic shifts helped to drive this new political chemistry. The Black Death of the mid-14th century had cut populations drastically and shaken traditional hierarchies, accelerating the decline of serfdom in some regions while entrenching it in others. Towns took on new significance as centers of trade and credit, and the rise of monetary economy weakened the old feudal dues that had once bound lords to peasant labor. The Hanseatic League in the north, trading centers in Italy to the south, and mercantile networks across the Rhine and Danube ensured that the empire was a crossroads of commerce, which in turn empowered urban elites and altered noble strategies. Cultural currents fed the political tides. Humanism and the spread of printed books gave rise to new vocabularies about law, governance, and religion. Learned jurists codified Roman law and adapted it to Germanic conditions, creating a corpus of public law that politicians and princes used to justify new claims. Universities trained administrators and lawyers who moved between courts, cities, and imperial institutions, carrying norms and precedents that knitted disparate places into a shared legal culture. In this sense, the empire was being reformed not only by edict and diet but by language, education, and the slow construction of expertise. When Martin Luther published his 95 Theses in 1517, he did not merely spark a religious controversy, he ignited a transformation that pierced every institution of the realm. Luther's critique of indulgences and of papal authority resonated in a landscape primed for contest. Princes who had long chafed under ecclesiastical jurisdictions and who coveted church lands found in the Reformation both a doctrine and an opportunity. Cities with printing presses and university scholars became centers of Protestant thought, while rural populations wrestled with questions of liturgy, piety, and economic burden. The religious division that followed became intertwined with politics. The imperial diet at Worms in 1521 declared Luther an outlaw but could not eradicate his influence. Over the next decades, Protestant princes and cities consolidated confessional identities, drafting church orders to regulate worship and social life. Catholic rulers responded with their own reforms, and the Catholic Reformation, reinforced by the Jesuit order and the Council of Trent, sought to reinvigorate Catholic belief and discipline. Vision and governance were now inseparable. A prince's choice of confession affected courts, taxes, education, and alliances. This confessionalization intensified patterns of fragmentation. Where once legal pluralism had been a tolerable irregularity, religious difference created durable fault lines. The 1555 Peace of Augsburg attempted to stabilize matters with the formula cuius regio, ius religio, meaning that the ruler's religion would determine the religion of his subjects. It was a pragmatic compromise that acknowledged the reality of divided loyalties, but it came with limits. It recognized only Lutheranism and Catholicism, leaving out other forms of Protestantism like Calvinism. It also did not solve the problem of ecclesiastical territories, where bishops and abbots could be replaced by secular rulers, raising contested questions about property and rights. Economic pressures and social dislocation added fuel to religious conflict. High taxation, conscription, and inflation affected different classes unevenly, and peasants, in particular, suffered the consequences of changing agricultural practices and lordly demands. The German Peasants' War of 1524–25 was partly inspired by reformist rhetoric, and it exposed the volatile mixture of social grievance and theological argument. When leaders and princes crushed the uprising with brutal force, they clarified that the political order would tolerate religious dissent only within limits set by territorial lords. The fragmentation of authority also reshaped military realities. The rise of professional infantry, of mercenary bands like the Landsknechts, and of artillery altered the strategic calculations of princes. Warfare was becoming more expensive and more technological, which pushed rulers to seek new revenue sources and to centralize fiscal systems. Yet the emperor could not simply centralize across the empire. The patchwork of landlords retained the ability to raise troops, levy taxes, and build fortifications, producing a diffuse military landscape in which cooperation was hard-won and fragile. The Habsburgs grew in this environment by a combination of marriage, inheritance, and intermittent imperial authority. From the late 15th century onward, the imperial crown frequently rested upon their shoulders, and their dynastic strategy stitched lands across Europe into a vast patrimony. But being emperor did not make them absolute. Habsburg kings relied on compromises with electors and princes, and their attempts to centralize authority often met resistance. They nonetheless pursued policies that aimed to restore Catholic conformity and to strengthen dynastic control, a course that would collide with the confessional map of the 16th and 17th centuries. Between the Peace of Augsburg and the outbreak of the 30 Years' War, there were decades of uneasy balance. Calvinism spread quietly in many territories, often among merchants and urban elites, despite its formal exclusion from Augsburg. The imperial courts and the Diet wrestled with questions of precedence, legal remedies, and the rights of confession, seeking to regulate an increasingly pluralistic order. Meanwhile, the Counter-Reformation made gains. Catholic seminaries reformed clerical education, the Jesuits forged powerful networks in schools and courts, and the papacy cultivated alliances with Catholic princes. Political alliances became more fluid and more transactional. Religious identity mattered deeply, but so did dynastic interest and economic calculation. France, a Catholic kingdom, entered into geopolitical arrangements that supported Protestant powers when that suited its interest in checking Habsburg encirclement. Princes brokered marriages, exchanged pensions, and negotiated military support across confessional lines, creating a diplomatic web that reflected the limits of both confessional solidarity and territorial sovereignty. The immediate lead-up to the 30 Years' War reveals the limits of imperial authority and the explosive potential of local disputes. Bohemia, with its history of Hussite contestation and arrestive nobility, became a flashpoint. When the Habsburgs attempted to assert Catholic control and to curtail the rights of Protestant estates, a rupture ensued. The defenestration of Prague in 1618, when Protestant nobles hurled imperial officials from a castle window, was dramatic but also symbolic of deeper tensions, issues of religious liberty, local rights, and the contest between centralizing impulses and territorial autonomy. What followed was an escalation that transformed regional conflict into a pan-European conflagration. The Bohemian Revolt quickly drew in neighboring states and foreign powers. The Holy Roman Emperor, Ferdinand II, with a vision of reinforced Catholic and imperial order, seemed to many to be pushing too hard toward centralization and confessional uniformity. His policies, including the Edict of Restitution in 1629, which sought to return secularized church properties to the Catholic Church, alarmed Protestant princes and convinced neutral parties that the Habsburgs intended to remake the political map to their advantage. The war itself unfolded in phases, each with its own character and actors. In the early years, the imperial forces and their Catholic allies, backed by Spanish support, pursued successes that reasserted Catholic control in substantial regions. Later, the intervention of Denmark under King Christian IV reflected concerns about Baltic interests and Protestant protection. When Gustavus Adolphus of Sweden entered in 1630, the conflict acquired a novel military dimension. Swedish reforms in tactics and logistics, combined with Protestant sluices of support, changed the tempo of campaigning. Gustavus Adolphus became a figure of mythic resonance, a Protestant warrior king whose military skill and discipline made the Swedish army a decisive factor. Yet his involvement was not purely religious. Sweden sought influence in northern Germany and control of the Baltic. For the Holy Roman Empire, the Swedish intervention widened the war and introduced another level of foreign entanglement. The French, under Cardinal Richelieu, soon entered the fray on the Protestant side, a striking development in which a Catholic monarchy fought to limit Habsburg dominance and to shape the balance of power in Europe. By the middle of the war, the empire was a theater for competing dynastic, confessional, and national ambitions. Armies crisscrossed the countryside, sieges devastated towns, and mercenary forces lived off the land in ways that decimated civilian life. The combination of famine, disease, and the destruction of crops and infrastructure led to catastrophic population loss in many German territories. Some regions lost a third or more of their inhabitants, and the social fabric frayed as local elites struggled to collect taxes and to maintain order amidst chaos. The legal and institutional consequences of the war were profound. Imperial institutions found themselves unable to impose stability, while many princes discovered that their autonomy rested on their ability to survive and to make separate peace when necessary. The struggle between the Imperial Audit Council, an imperial court attached directly to the emperor, and the Imperial Chamber Court revealed deeper tensions about legal competence and the emperor's reach. As violence intensified, the need for a negotiated political settlement grew more urgent. Negotiation culminated in the Peace of Westphalia, a suite of treaties signed in 1648 that would reshape the political fiction of the empire. These agreements recognized the de facto sovereignty of imperial princes in matters of internal governance, confirming that the ruler of a territory had the primary authority over religion, while also protecting the rights of minority confessions under certain conditions. Importantly, the treaties acknowledged Calvinism alongside Lutheranism and Catholicism, resolving one of the critical limitations of the Augsburg settlement. Westphalia curbed the emperor's ability to impose policy across the empire and enhanced the status of the imperial estates as entities of international law. Princes gained the right to maintain diplomatic relations and to conduct foreign policy within limits, and the imperial circles were given more explicit roles in organizing defense and fiscal measures. The empire remained as an entity, but its legal architecture shifted. It became a framework for coexistence rather than a centralized polity capable of sweeping reform. The economic implications were no less significant. The devastation of the war required reconstruction and a realignment of productive patterns. Towns that had been centers of trade and manufacturing had to rebuild guilds, markets, and connections. Many rulers sought to stimulate recovery through fiscal innovations, currency reform, state monopolies, and the encouragement of manufactories. In some regions, landlords tightened control over peasantry to extract resources, while in others new forms of tenancy and proto-capitalist agriculture emerged. Religious life adjusted to new realities as well. The war had hardened confessional identities, but it also produced pragmatic arrangements for coexistence. Mixed territories established complex local accommodations for worship, and the nobility and urban elites often favored stability over doctrinal purity. The Catholic Reformation remained vigorous in some areas, while Protestant theology continued to evolve into various Lutheran and Reformed forms. In all cases, the nexus between confession and governance had become permanent. Spiritual allegiance was now a matter of public order as much as private belief. Culturally, the shock of conflict and the resilience of institutions produced a flowering of legal scholarship and a body of writing about statehood that would feed early modern political thought. Jurists and theorists reflected on sovereignty, on the rights of princes versus imperial prerogatives, and on the nature of international law. The notion of territorial sovereignty, though contested, gained force as rulers and writers described realms as units whose legal personality mattered beyond the emperor's formalities. The empire that emerged from this crucible was changed but not destroyed. It persisted as a legal and political entity, an assembly of princely territories, ecclesiastical dominions, and free cities tied together by a shared imperial tissue and by common institutions. Yet the balance of center and periphery had shifted toward the latter. Territorial princes could now act with greater independence, engage in diplomacy, and shape their internal confessional and fiscal arrangements with less immediate imperium from the emperor. In that sense, the fragmentation that had characterized the late Middle Ages became, after decades of war and negotiation, a durable model for European order. This transformation carried paradoxical effects. On the one hand, fragmentation limited the capacity for centralized reform and made the region more vulnerable to external intervention, as the 30 Years' War had shown. On the other hand, the dispersal of authority allowed for local experimentation in administration, law, and economy. Cities could cultivate commercial innovation, principalities could develop unique fiscal systems and military institutions. Religious communities could fashion confessional identities suited to local conditions. The mosaic fostered resilience through diversity even as it complicated any attempt at coherent, uniform governance. The role of reform after Westphalia was thus not about creating a single, unified state. Rather, reform meant the institutionalization of decentralized sovereignty, the strengthening of mechanisms that could manage conflict between territorial actors, and the professionalization of governance at multiple levels. Imperial circles became platforms for coordination. Courts tried to articulate common rules. Diplomatic practice adapted to the reality of many sovereignties, developing protocols for negotiation among equals who nonetheless recognized some shared imperial constraints. Patterns of lordship and peasant life adapted too. In some regions, the war and its aftermath entrenched serfdom and reinforced aristocratic control as elites sought to secure revenues. In others, landlords who needed to attract labor offered better terms, and market-oriented agriculture expanded. These local variations highlight the point that fragmentation was not uniform, it was a spectrum of possibilities in which economic, cultural, and geographical factors produced different outcomes across the empire's vast terrain. The persistence of ecclesiastical principalities added another layer to this variegated picture. Prince-bishops and abbots continued to preside over complex territories where spiritual duties coexisted with secular power. The Counter-Reformation strengthened some Catholic sees, while the secularization of church lands in certain areas created new opportunities for territorial expansion. The legal status of these ecclesiastical domains was a recurring subject of negotiation, reflecting the mixture of sacred and secular forces that defined the empire's governance. Looked at from the vantage of the later 17th century, the Holy Roman Empire after the 30 Years' War was a system that accepted limits. It accepted that imperial authority would be mediated by estates, that law would be the glue of a plural polity, and that diplomacy would be a primary means of regulating disputes. These accommodations suited a Europe increasingly aware of balance of power calculations and less inclined toward universal claims. The empire, in its reformed but fragmented state, became a kind of laboratory for these new practices of interstate relations. Yet the story of fragmentation and reform is not simply a narrative of loss or gain. It is a story about adaptability. The same fracturing that had made centralized rule impossible also produced a political culture in which negotiation, legal argument, and institutional creativity mattered. Princes hired jurists to craft titles and privileges, cities negotiated charters and trade rights, confessions organized schools and networks that shaped public life. Out of fragmentation came institutions that could hold together despite competing interests. This multiplicity also fostered cultural richness. The German lands became arenas for musical innovation, for the growth of printing and vernacular literature, and for the diffusion of scientific and philosophical ideas. Patrons in courts and cities supported artists and scholars whose works reflected both local identity and broader European currents. That cultural vitality coexisted with political weakness in defense and coherence, producing a characteristic tension. The region was intellectually and artistically fecund even as it remained politically diffuse. When historians look back, they note how the empire's structure influenced broader European developments. The model of territorial sovereigns with the right to conduct foreign policy helped normalize the idea of the state as the primary unit of international politics. The legal doctrines refined by imperial jurists fed into the early modern international law that theorists like Hugo Grotius would soon articulate. In short, the empire's internal fragmentation had external implications, helping to shape the architecture of the modern international system. The human cost of centuries of contested authority is also part of the story. War, forced migration, and disease left scars on landscapes and memories. Communities rebuilt in different patterns, families dispersed, local traditions adapted. Yet the persistence of local law and custom meant that many places retained a distinctiveness that survived even the most brutal disruptions. That continuity amid change is an essential part of why the imperial model endured in one form or another until the upheavals of the 19th century. Finally, the trajectory from fragmentation through repeated reform efforts up to the Westphalian settlement offers a lesson about the interplay of power and law. Reformers tried to engineer cohesion by creating institutions and codifying procedures, but those institutions had to live in a world of deep-seated local interests and entrenched prerogatives. The result was an order of negotiated sovereignty, a networked polity in which law mattered more and force mattered less, relatively speaking, because even force required consent to be sustained over time. There are no tidy endings in such histories, because outcomes were layered and uneven. The Holy Roman Empire did not vanish in 1648, it lingered as a political organism that continued to evolve, carrying within it the legacy of fragmentation and the imprint of reform. What Westphalia produced was less a final resolution than a new equilibrium, a recalibrated balance between local autonomy and collective frameworks that would define Central Europe for generations. That balance was fragile, creative, often contradictory, and always telling of the deep-rooted pluralism at the heart of the empire. The twilight of the Holy Roman Empire did not arrive like a sudden storm. It was a long, slow unthreading of a tapestry that had been woven for 1,000 years. By the late 18th century, the empire had become a complex, fragile patchwork of principalities, bishoprics, imperial cities, free knights, and princely courts, each clinging to its own privileges and identities. It remained holy and Roman in name, but in practice it resembled a mosaic of overlapping legalities and loyalties, and that mosaic was about to be rearranged by forces born in revolutionary France. Understanding the end of the empire requires tracing how old certainties were eroded, how new ideas and armies poured across the Rhine, and how rulers large and small adapted, resisted, or were swept aside. The French Revolution began as a convulsion across the Rhine, but its echo reached deep into the stick and stone of German territories. Ideas of liberty and equality, which in France mutated into terror and then into the rise of a military genius, also undermined the theological and legal foundations of the imperial order. Beyond abstract principles, the revolution unleashed a tidal wave of practical consequences: the collapse of feudal incomes, the export of the French administrative model, and the mobilization of mass armies that could reshape borders by force. These changes made the old Holy Roman structure look not merely old-fashioned, but impotent in the face of decisive centralized power. Napoleon Bonaparte emerged from the crucible of the revolution as both a product of it and its greatest transmuter. He was a commander who understood that wars now yielded territory, legitimacy, and legal systems, and he moved with a mixture of calculation and charisma to remake Europe. His campaigns across the German states forced sovereignties to choose sides, and those choices precipitated a chain of reforms and consolidations inside the empire. Where once territorial fragmentation seemed immutable, the French military and political presence made consolidation both necessary and possible. The first great legal earthquake within the empire was the Reichsdeputationsschluss of 1803, a name as unwieldy as the upheaval it described. Under the pressure of French victories and diplomatic bargaining, the imperial diet authorized a massive secularization and mediatization. Church lands were seized and redistributed to secular princes, and hundreds of tiny imperial immediate territories were absorbed into larger neighbors. This redistribution aimed to compensate those rulers who had lost territory west of the Rhine to France, but its side effects were far-reaching. Monastic communities were dissolved, bishops lost temporal power, and the political map of Central Europe shifted toward fewer, stronger states. Secularization was not a mere administrative adjustment, it was a cultural rupture. Monasteries had been centers of learning, charity, and local governance for centuries, and their suppression displaced clergy, scholars, and social services. Many monasteries had accumulated art and libraries, which were confiscated or dispersed, changing the cultural patrimony of regions overnight. The social fabric that bound peasants to lordly and ecclesiastical authorities began to fray as the legal and economic ties that had undergirded local life were rewritten to suit a new political calculus. Mediatization went hand in hand with secularization, and it produced a profound alteration in the hierarchy of states inside the empire. Small immediate territories, imperial cities, diminutive counties, and knightly domains lost their direct relationship to the emperor and were incorporated under the sovereignty of larger states like Bavaria, Württemberg, Baden, and Hesse. Though local dynasts often kept their titles and some honors, their political independence vanished. This process created a new class of dispossessed elites, princes and knights who retained rank but lost the power that had defined them for generations. The newly enlarged territorial states did not simply absorb lands, they began to impose new administrative systems, centralized taxation, and legal codes inspired by French models. Napoleonic governance left an imprint that was simultaneously modernizing and coercive, bringing civil registers, property cadasters, and more rational bureaucracy. These reforms often dismantled the old web of privileges that favored clergy and nobility, replacing them with systems based on merit, service, and state-directed efficiency. For many citizens, the initial shock of military uprising was followed by the steady, sometimes welcome logic of more predictable administration. Napoleon's diplomatic creation, the Confederation of the Rhine, was the decisive political instrument that made the end of the Holy Roman Empire inevitable. In 1806, a grouping of German states, from Bavaria to Saxony, accepted protection by France and the abolition of the remaining imperial structures, effectively dissolving their ties to Vienna. The Confederation standardized alliances and obligations in a way that undercut the emperor's residual authority. It represented not merely a French client structure but a German reorganization that favored territorial rulers who sought to modernize and consolidate power under their own flags. The fall of the imperial crown was as much symbolic as it was legal, and Emperor Francis II confronted an impossible choice. He had already proclaimed himself Emperor of Austria in 1804 to secure Habsburg prestige and the dynasty's continued sovereignty in the face of French ennoblements and reorganizations. The creation of the Austrian imperial title was a preemptive adaptation, and when the Confederation of the Rhine formed in 1806, Francis renounced the title of Holy Roman Emperor and declared the centuries-old empire dissolved. The act was both pragmatic and melancholic, a recognition that the political world had drifted away from the medieval structure that had legitimized imperial rule. The abdication and dissolution were surrounded by legal formalities and personal sorrow, but they also reflected a broader shift of legitimacy from transnational sacred claims to territorial sovereignty. For centuries, the emperor had claimed an authority that transcended borders, still riding on ancient ceremonies and claims to Christian universality. By 1806, that claim was hollow. Sovereignty was increasingly territorial, tied to conscription, tax systems, and the ability to administer laws across a contiguous land. The world was becoming modern in ways that left medieval universals out of fashion. Among the most immediate consequences of dissolution was the reorientation of diplomacy and warfare in German lands. Where once German princes had navigated the imperial lattice for leverage, they now negotiated bilaterally with stronger neighbors and with France. Military conscription and the logistical demands of modern war required consolidated states capable of raising and equipping large armies. Smaller polities, unable to field sizable forces or fund modern administration, found themselves bound into larger entities or under the protection of great powers. Napoleon's influence carried paradoxical gifts. It weakened the old imperial order but also stimulated national consciousness in new forms. The occupation and the reforms provoked resentment and a sense of common grievance among German speakers who had formerly existed as subjects of a fragmented political landscape. Military defeats and humiliations, most famously Prussia's devastation after Jena and Auerstedt in 1806, catalyzed a re-examination of state structures, military institutions, and education systems. Intellectuals, soldiers, and reform-minded princes began to speak of what it might mean to create a German nation rather than a patchwork of dynastic domains. The Prussian reform movement exemplified this transformation. After crushing defeats, Prussia undertook deep reforms. It restructured the army, introduced meritocratic promotions, reformed the bureaucracy, and began a redefinition of citizenship that involved more than merely binding peasants to land. Thinkers such as Stein and Hardenberg aimed to create a modern state capable of competing with Napoleonic France, and their policies rippled across German lands. These changes, while intended to restore Prussian power, also sowed seeds of modernization that would have consequences far beyond Prussia's borders. Napoleon's retreat after the Russian campaign and the subsequent wars of liberation provided the moment when these reform energies consolidated into a larger anti-French coalition. In 1813, the German states turned on their former ally, and armies of varied provenance advanced into Central Europe in an effort to roll back French hegemony. The battles of Leipzig and later the invasion of France in 1814 reshaped the map once more. The French retreat forced the question of what would replace imperial structures: a return to the old empire, a new German federation, or some other arrangement entirely. The Congress of Vienna in 1814 to 1815 was the decisive attempt to restore order after the Napoleonic upheavals, and its architects sought stability through balance rather than national unification. The conservative diplomats, most notably Metternich of Austria and Castlereagh of Britain, feared that nationalist and revolutionary energies could destabilize Europe unless channeled into conservative institutions. They therefore created the German Confederation, a loose association of 39 states under Austrian presidency, which sought to preserve princely sovereignty while enabling diplomatic coordination. It was intentionally ambiguous, not an empire, not a nation-state, but a diplomatic framework meant to prevent the resurgence of French power and revolutionary contagion. The German Confederation did not recreate the imperial order, it institutionalized the post-imperial balance. It kept states sovereign and maintained reactionary regimes in many places, while instituting a superstate assembly in Frankfurt where princes and envoys met. For liberals and nationalists, the Confederation was a disappointment, an obstacle to the kind of unified nation they imagined. For conservatives, it was a useful instrument, allowing larger powers to manage smaller ones and preventing any single German state from becoming too dominant. Although the Confederation preserved princely rights, the social and economic landscape continued to change. Industrialization crept into German lands, with factories, railways, and capital markets knitting regions into new economic zones. Zollverein, the customs union initiated by Prussia and expanding across many German territories, reduced internal tariffs and fostered economic integration without political unification. This economic cohesion began to produce shared interests and a sense of common destiny, even as political fragmentation persisted. The mediatized princes adapted in different ways to their altered status, some weaving themselves into the courts of the enlarged states, others nursing resentment and plotting for influence. Their titles retained social cachet, and marriages and networks allowed them to remain relevant in elite circles. Yet the reality of power had shifted decisively toward centralized bureaucracies, state officials, generals, and ministers who commanded budgets and armies. The social prestige of lineage lingered, but technical competence in administration increasingly determined who governed effectively. Religious consequences rippled from the secularizations of the Napoleonic era and persisted beyond the end of the empire. Clergy who had lost temporal domains sought new roles within national churches or academic life, and the Catholic Church had to navigate a landscape where dioceses and patronage were now often mediated by secular rulers. Protestant regions adopted state church models, where princes asserted control over ecclesiastical affairs, while Catholic areas negotiated concordats and settlements with dominant states. These arrangements would shape confessional politics in the German lands for decades. Legal culture changed irrevocably as well. The Napoleonic Code and other rationalized legal systems replaced a bewildering variety of customary laws in many territories, introducing codified property rights, contract law, and secular jurisprudence. Even states that rejected French political domination found that some of the administrative and legal reforms were too useful to discard. The result was a mixed legal heritage. Old privileges and local law persisted in places, while modern civil codes and standardized courts began to operate across larger territories. Cultural memory preserved a complex relationship to the old empire, nostalgia, critique, and reinvention intertwined in poetry, history, and the imagination. Romantic writers and intellectuals searched for an authentic German past, often romanticizing medieval lore, forests, and the sense of a cultural unity that transcended princes. At the same time, historians debated whether the empire had been a failed construct or a venerable, if flawed, framework for ordering diversity. This cultural negotiation informed political movements. Some conservatives invoked imperial traditions to defend old hierarchies, while liberals mined symbolism for national unity. Urban centers responded in varied ways to the post-imperial order. Cities that had long been semi-autonomous saw their privileges curtailed or transformed into bourgeois incorporation into larger state structures. Civic elites often found opportunities within modern administration, commerce, and industry, but they also sometimes lost local controls they had relied upon for municipal governance. Urban populations, growing with industrialization, became new political actors whose demands for representation and services would challenge traditional elites. On the diplomatic stage, the end of the empire altered alliance patterns across Europe. Austria retained a hegemonic role as the leading German power, but it had to contend with the rising strength of Prussia and the persistent ambitions of France, Britain, and Russia. The Concert of Europe, an informal system of diplomacy and periodic congresses, aimed to manage great power relations and prevent revolution. But it also froze certain conflicts that later erupted in the quest for national unification. The diplomatic architecture of the 19th century was thus built on the ruins of imperial legitimacy and the compromises of Vienna. The memory of 1806 and the Napoleonic disruptions became a political resource exploited by different movements. Conservatives used the chaos of revolutionary France to justify order and the suppression of national agitation. Liberals and nationalists, however, used the experience of occupation and reform to argue that only a unified Germany could protect its people and modernize effectively. The rhetorical battleground often turned on who could claim continuity with German cultural and legal tradition while also promising progress and strength. The long shadow of mediatization extended into social life as landed elites adjusted to new economic realities. Former ruling houses had to negotiate their financial survival, sometimes aligning with industrial capitalists or state courts of honor to preserve dignity and influence. Agricultural reforms had altered peasant obligations and land tenure, sometimes improving conditions and sometimes deepening dependence on market forces. These transitions were experienced unevenly, and social unrest occasionally flared where reforms threatened livelihoods without offering alternatives. Women's lives also changed in subtle but consequential ways as governance and economies modernized. Noble women who once managed courtly households found their roles reshaped by the shrinking of princely courts, while bourgeois women in growing cities encountered new social expectations tied to industrial labor and urban life. Clerical reform and secular education altered opportunities for some women, and the shifting legal codes redefined aspects of property and inheritance in ways that touched family life. These changes did not create equality, but they did change the contexts in which women lived and made choices. Military culture underwent profound transformation after the Napoleonic period, as the logic of mass conscription and national armies displaced feudal levies and mercenary forces. Officers increasingly came from professional military schools and state bureaucracies rather than solely from noble birth, and military reform became a vector for broader social mobility in some states. The experience of warfare between 1805 and 1815 also instilled a new tactical and organizational understanding that influenced later conflicts, including the wars of German unification later in the century. The economic integration that followed mediatization and the Confederation included not only Zollverein but also the gradual building of transport and communication networks. Railways began to stitch the German lands into a single economic space, reducing travel times and altering the markets for commodities, labor, and ideas. The spread of newspapers and telegraphy accelerated the circulation of political and cultural currents, making the notion of a shared German public more tangible. Economic modernity thus created the material basis for political nationalism to emerge with force in the decades to come. Education was another realm reshaped in the wake of the empire's end. Prussian schooling reforms, including compulsory primary education and a reformed university system, spread models of state-directed education that emphasized civic virtue, technical skill, and national narratives. Enlightened curricular reforms combined with romantic ideals produced institutions that trained both administrators and intellectuals who would carry forward ideas about national identity. These educated classes played crucial roles in forming the ideological foundations of later movements for unification and reform. The legal principle of sovereignty matured into a doctrine that underpinned 19th-century statecraft. Once sovereignty had become tied to the capacity to legislate within defined borders, state actors demanded the exclusive authority to tax, conscript, and adjudicate. The Holy Roman Empire's overlapping jurisdictions, which had allowed external authorities and internal estates to coexist, faded in the face of this more unitary conception. Modern states thus consolidated power in ways that the empire's architecture could not conceivably accommodate. The dissolution's human stories are worth pausing on. Individual families who lost titles, towns that gained new rulers, and priests who lost livelihoods. For many people, the changes were experienced not as grand historical shifts but as immediate disruptions, new taxes, altered markets, and different laws on marriage and inheritance. Some found liberation in the decline of feudal constraints, others suffered from the loss of traditional protections. These local narratives are the texture that completes the picture of systemic change. Diplomatically, the post-imperial era also produced an age of legal rethinking about treaties, recognition, and legitimacy. States sought to secure their gains through dynastic marriage, negotiated settlements, and participation in the concert of Europe. The language of legitimacy increasingly relied on written treaties and diplomatic protocol rather than on coronations and papal approbation. International law thus matured alongside domestic reform in ways that would govern state interactions for decades. The Habsburg monarchy itself adapted by consolidating its imperial resources into a multinational empire that no longer claimed the Holy Roman mantle. Austria became the center of a diverse realm stretching from the Alps to the Carpathians, requiring complex governance strategies to manage linguistic, religious, and cultural plurality. Metternich's diplomacy rested on this multinationalism as a bulwark against nationalism, yet the very diversity that made the Habsburg state powerful would later present internal challenges. Austria's pivot from Holy Roman Emperor to Austrian sovereign illustrates how dynastic adaptation could prolong certain forms of power while abandoning symbolic universals. The law codes and administrative templates left by Napoleonic rule persisted because they were often more efficient and more comprehensible than older alternatives. Courts that handled civil disputes, registers that documented property, and bureaucracies that collected taxes persisted because they worked. Even states that prided themselves on tradition adopted these instruments were useful, creating a patchwork of legal modernity across German lands. Over time, such normalizations prepared the ground for more coherent legal systems associated with unified states. Nationalist movements in the decades after 1815 varied widely in intensity and aims, from moderate calls for greater unity to radical republicanism that wanted to overthrow dynastic rule entirely. Student groups, intellectual societies, and liberal clubs met and published, pushing a discourse that combined cultural unity with political reform. Governments often responded with repression, censorship, and police action. The Carlsbad Decrees of 1819 are a prime example, designed to clamp down on student agitation and liberal press. These tensions revealed that the end of the Holy Roman Empire had not ended political contestation. Rather, it had shifted the terrain on which it took place. Throughout the German lands, the social composition of politics gradually changed as a more public-minded bourgeoisie assumed influence alongside the remaining aristocracy. Merchants, lawyers, and professionals found roles in municipal councils and provincial administrations, and their interests often aligned with economic modernization and legal predictability. This rising class played a central role in the calls for constitutional government and for the creation of national institutions that could protect property and commerce. The old barons and ecclesiastical rulers were thereby joined and sometimes displaced by new actors who sought modern legitimacy. By mid-century, the forces unleashed in the Napoleonic era had produced both consolidation and contradiction. Prussia had emerged as a reformed and more efficient state, while Austria remained the custodian of the old order and the defender of multilateral diplomacy. Smaller states hovered between modernization and dependence, and nationalist sentiment simmered beneath surface stability. The political outcome remained uncertain, and the legal and institutional legacies of 1803 to 1806 continued to shape the strategies of rulers and rebels alike. The symbolic end of the Holy Roman Empire therefore inaugurated a long century of reconfiguration rather than a simple replacement. The empire's end was not a clean rupture so much as an acceleration of processes already underway: centralization, secularization, legal codification, and the politicization of national belonging. As the 19th century unfolded, these trends would converge into new political forms, some conservative, some liberal, some nationalist, each drawing in its own way on the memory of imperial structures and the experience of Napoleonic modernization. Trade and capital markets adapted to the new political realities by integrating the German lands into broader European and global economies. Merchants who had struggled with myriad tolls and territorial barriers found new opportunities in unified customs arrangements and improved infrastructure. That economic growth, uneven as it was, contributed to urbanization and labor shifts that would later feed democratic and social movements. The material basis for a future German polity was being laid as much in rail yards and factories as in the halls of diplomacy. Artists and writers engaged with the end of the empire through a variety of lenses, sometimes mourning loss and sometimes celebrating newfound civic energies. Romantic painters depicted meditative ruins and pastoral landscapes as symbols of a disappearing world, while poets and dramatists interrogated the meaning of nationhood and the costs of modernization. Public festivals and commemorations reimagined medieval pageantry for new political uses, and the past was constantly repurposed to serve present agendas. Cultural life thus became a field where memory and invention collided, shaping popular attachments to place and polity. The legal and political displacements produced a generation of lawyers, administrators, and politicians trained in modern institutions who would later build the scaffolding of nation-states. These professionals traveled between courts and ministries, carrying ideas about efficient governance, constitutionalism, and national interest. Their technical expertise mattered because modern states required expertise to manage railways, funds, conscription lists, and foreign treaties. In this sense, the dissolution of the empire helped create the class of bureaucratic professionals essential to 19th-century statecraft. Over time, the psychological shift from imperial universals to territorial sovereignty altered how people imagined belonging. Loyalties that had once been diffuse, to empire, to Holy Roman dignity, to local lordship, slowly reconstituted into sentiments tied to language, shared law, and common economic interest. This process was messy and incomplete. Many people continued to identify with localities and dynasties as much as with any proto-national identity. Yet the new forms of belonging proved politically potent and eventually provided the emotional fuel for unification movements. The end of the Holy Roman Empire also had effects beyond the German lands, for European diplomacy learned new habits in response to Napoleon and its own dissolution. States practiced collective security through congresses and balance of power politics, but they also began to accommodate the idea that national aspirations could be a force to reckon with. Colonial empires and overseas concerns often drew attention away from Central Europe, yet the lessons of German reorganization were watched closely by other multi-ethnic empires seeking solutions to internal diversity. Thus, the empire's demise contributed to a broader European experiment in reconciling order with the pressures of modernity. When historians look back on 1806, they often debate whether the Holy Roman Empire should be mourned for its passing or praised for having created a space in which diverse communities could coexist under a symbolic umbrella. The truth is ambivalent. The empire had been both a protector of local particularisms and an obstacle to efficient governance, a repository of tradition and a source of legal confusion. Its dissolution marked the end of certain protections and privileges, and also cleared space for the modern nation-state, with all the gains and losses that entailed. In private correspondence of the period, nobles wrote of humiliation and adaptation, bureaucrats wrote of opportunity, and common folk wrote of everyday disruptions. These letters and diaries reveal that the tragedy and triumph of the era were lived in ordinary acts: the registration of property, the redefinition of personal status, and the negotiation of new taxes. Such microhistories show that the fall of the empire was not merely an event for treaties and crowns, it was a lived transformation that affected marriages, inheritances, and daily governance. By the time nationalist politics culminated in the mid to late 19th century, the political map that had been redrawn in the Napoleonic era served as both template and foil. Some states like Bavaria and Saxony had been elevated and had acquired modern administrations, others had been subordinated to larger neighbors. The memory of mediatization remained a grievance in some quarters and a historical fact in others, but it no longer dictated the political possibilities of a continent that was increasingly defined by large, centralized states and imperial competition abroad. As the century progressed, debates over federalism versus unification, monarchy versus parliament, and liberalism versus conservatism played out on the stage that the post-imperial reorganization had created. The dissolution of the Holy Roman Empire was not the last word in German history, rather, it was the opening chapter of a new story in which old dynasties, modern bureaucracies, emergent bourgeoisies, and nationalist movements contended for the future. The 19th century would witness further conflict and compromise before the map of Germany settled into forms recognizable to modern eyes. In the end, the fall of the Holy Roman Empire was both an endpoint and a beginning, an end to an ancient legal religious order and a beginning to the politics of modern Europe. The repercussions were legal, administrative, cultural, and emotional, and they unfolded over decades rather than in a single dramatic moment. For listeners today, the story offers a lesson in how institutions born of sacred symbolism can be unmade by the pressures of military might, ideological change, and the relentless demands of administration. The empire's decline and dissolution remind us that political forms are mutable and that the landscapes of power are always subject to reinvention. Even as the 19th century marched onward, traces of the empire persisted in monuments, in ceremonies, and in legal relics. Imperial places like Frankfurt retained symbolic weight, and some elites continued to invoke imperial traditions in legitimating their rule. Yet the functional reality had shifted irrevocably toward states defined by contiguous territory, standing armies, and expert administration. The Holy Roman Empire remained a powerful idea, a reservoir of memory and rhetoric, but its institutional form had been superseded by modern political machines. So the end of the empire was not a simple story of triumph or tragedy, but a complex transition that reshaped Europe. It illustrates how revolutions, wars, and reforms interact to create new political orders, and how people adapt to those orders in ways that are pragmatic, resistant, and creative. In the space between the imperial past and the national future, millions of lives were remade, and the map of Central Europe acquired the outlines that would matter for the century to come. In listening to that transformation, one hears both the clatter of battlements and the quiet scratching of clerks transferring property records, the noisy and the mundane interwoven in historical change. Subscribe if you feel you too would have fought, adapted, or resisted as Europe was remade from the ruins of empire.